Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment I stepped off the elevator that night, a chill wrapped itself around my neck, clinging to my skin like a clammy hand. The overhead lights flickered once before going out, completely plunging the 18th floor into a silent darkness. I'd grown used to navigating this space with only a flashlight and the faint glow of exit signs in the distance, but it never felt right. Something about this particular floor still under construction had always felt incomplete, not just in the physical sense of exposed pipes and half-demolished walls, but in the intangible sense that something else lurked there unseen and waiting. Even before I saw the faint silhouette near the plastic-covered windows, I sensed I wasn't alone. I work as a janitor in a commercial building downtown. I'm generally the first person in and the last person out, tasked with cleaning and minor maintenance. Though the building has dozens of floors, only a few remain under renovation. My supervisor insists these upper levels might be prone to leaks. If the weather is bad, rain has been relentless lately, so my nightly routine includes trudging up here with a flashlight, scanning for any sign of water intrusion or structural damage. I've never liked this job, but I've never outright feared it either, until I found myself trapped in this suffocating darkness, accompanied by a presence I couldn't name. The 18th floor is a construction zone in limbo-wide beams and half-erected walls. Partition the space into a maze of corridors. Electrical wiring dangles from the ceiling, occasionally brushing my hair. If I'm not paying attention, sheets of plastic have been stapled over the windows to protect against rain and wind. They flutter with eerie vibrations whenever a draft sneaks in through the cracks. The floor is usually deserted at night because the construction crew rarely works past dusk. The supervisors told me to stay vigilant for any leaks, but they failed to mention how unnerving it would feel, scanning my flashlight across bare concrete and half-finished surfaces, searching for signs of dampness while feeling an inexplicable weight behind my back. Typically, I try to complete my inspection quickly. The place is cold and uninviting, and the overhead lights almost never work. They're probably disconnected while the electricians run new wiring. A solitary flashlight beam is all I have to guide my steps, along with the occasional ambient glow from the city lights seeping through the covered windows. But the plastic sheets warp and twist those lights, creating distorted shadows that quiver like living creatures on the unfinished walls. It started with subtle details. At first, it was just a strange reflection, an odd shape I spotted on the far side of the room. I would turn expecting to see a piece of equipment or a stray ladder propped against a wall, but there was nothing. This phenomenon was so fleeting. It was easy to dismiss it as a trick of the light, or my own tiredness. Night shifts wear you down slowly, and it's common to see illusions when you're exhausted. But as the days passed, I began feeling an uncomfortable sense of being watched. It wasn't the typical paranoia that sometimes creeps in when you're alone in a big space. It was sharper, more invasive, like someone's stare boring into the back of my head. Each time I pivoted around, flashlight raised, there was no one there yet. The feeling lingered just out of sight, making the hairs on my arms stand up and my stomach churn with an unsettling mix of dread and adrenaline. On one particularly wet night, I made my routine trip upstairs. The power was down and my flashlight was the only source of illumination. I tried to ignore the goosebumps forming on my forearms, telling myself it was just the cold air. The plastic sheets over the windows were billowing erratically, creating a faint, repetitive rustling sound that set my teeth on edge all at once. I noticed a silhouette. It was near the far window where a large section of plastic was taped from top to bottom. I remember stopping in my tracks so abruptly that I nearly dropped the flashlight. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to discern the shape in the darkness. It seemed like a human figure, too tall and thin to be one of the metallic beams. It didn't move at first, just stood there, barely outlined by the hazy city lights filtering through the plastic. A sudden rush of adrenaline spiked through me, and I whipped the flashlight up toward the window, but by the time the beam hit that spot, there was only the gently flapping plastic. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it echo in my eardrums. My skin began to itch with perspiration, and I gulped a shaky breath, attempting to steady myself. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks, but deep down I knew something was off later. The weirdness escalated while checking the far corner for leaks. I heard soft footsteps on the bare concrete behind me. They were too faint to belong to a booted construction worker, and they matched my own pace in a delayed manner like an echo. I froze, heart hammering, and focused on the sound as soon as I turned around. Silence complete and abrupt, as if whatever followed me had dissolved into thin air. That was the moment I felt real fear. My pulse thuddered in my temples, and the flashlight trembled in my hand. I tried to reassure myself that the building sometimes carried echoes that my own footsteps might bounce off distant surfaces. But the more I repeated that in my mind, the less I believed it. When I shared these experiences with my supervisor, he just shrugged and said something like, "Maybe you should get more sleep." Implying that I was overreacting, he did, however, mention that an electrician had complained about strange noises on that floor a few weeks prior, but no one took it seriously. They had chalked it up to rodents scurrying behind the walls. Despite my growing unease, I couldn't avoid my duty. The leaks needed to be checked, and I was the one assigned to do it. I decided that next time I'd be more vigilant, more methodical. I wanted to prove to myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe there was a reflective surface or an oddly placed piece of equipment creating illusions, so I arrived an hour earlier than usual, hoping the construction lights would still be on, but predictably the crew had wrapped up for the day and the floor was already plunged into darkness. With a resigned sigh, I flicked on my flashlight and stepped out of the elevator. The air felt heavier than normal. My chest tightened as though the oxygen were thinner here. I moved through the half-finished corridors, inspecting the corners for any signs of water. Each step felt loaded with anticipation. That was when I noticed new footprints on the dusty floor. They looked fresh, forming a trail that wound down the hallway. They were too large to be mine, and yet they led directly to the same window where I had seen the silhouette. My scalp prickled. I followed them, each step slower than the last, my flashlight beam trembling over the fine layer of dust. The footprints ended abruptly a few feet from the window, as though whoever made them had been lifted off the ground or simply vanished. I swallowed back a swell of panic, trying to ignore the pounding in my ribcage. I scanned the vicinity, seeking some explanation. Was there a ladder, a hidden doorway? The plastic sheet rustled, and in that moment I saw it again. Just a fleeting hint of movement behind the opaque plastic, as if a figure was pressed against it from the outside. My breath caught the plastic, undulated an almost imperceptible bulge, then went flat. My brain screamed at me. That's impossible. We're 18 stories above the ground, and there's nothing outside but open air in the city. Skyline, that single moment felt like an eternity. My pulse thudded. Sweat gathered on my forehead, and my skin prickled with a coldness that went deeper than the chilly breeze, fighting the urge to bolt. I swept my flashlight from side to side, convinced that something stood just beyond my limited field of vision. The shadows elongated unnaturally, flickering in response to the beam. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and a numbness crept into my legs. If I didn't move, I was sure I'd collapse right there. Eventually, I willed myself to turn around and continue my inspection, determined to finish and leave. But each step forward felt like a confrontation with something intangible yet looming. I started hearing faint tapping noises, like someone gently knocking on the steel beams. They would start on one side of the room, then echo on the other. My flashlight's beam wavered as my hands began to shake uncontrollably. Despite my mind urging me to flee, I pressed on, telling myself that fear was making me hyper-aware of ordinary construction sounds. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew better. A few nights later, the tension escalated in ways that fully tested my sanity. I remember the building had been particularly empty that evening. Almost everyone else had left early due to severe weather warnings. The wind outside howled, rattling the plastic sheets like 1,000 fluttering wings. I could barely focus on the possibility of leaks anymore. My entire body was charged with dread. As I shone my flashlight along the walls, I saw them shadows that didn't align with my movement or with the few stationary objects around. They seemed to belong to figures that slipped in and out of view. I started sweating despite the cold, my shirt clinging to my back. My heart pounded and my breath came in frantic bursts. I felt the corners of the room closing in. Then I heard what can only be described as a whisper. It wasn't a voice speaking actual words, more like the hushed exhalation of air passing through the plastic barrier, but it carried an urgent tone that made my ears ring. The sound wound itself around my consciousness, burrowing into my mind. My eyes darted around, searching for the source. The darkness felt alive, pressing in, and I was trembling so fiercely my flashlight threatened to slip from my grip. I tried to regain composure. I told myself I would do one final sweep and then leave at the far end of the corridor near another sealed window. I saw a ripple in the darkness as though the shadows were bending inwards. My heart hammered like a drum and my chest tightened painfully. My knees wobbled and I swallowed hard in a kind of frenzy. Desperation, I forced myself closer, determined to confront whatever I was seeing. The air turned colder with each step, and my breath came out in small, visible puffs. The corridor grew dimmer as though my flashlight were losing power. Even though I'd replaced the batteries earlier when I reached the end of that corridor, I felt an oppressive presence pressing against me. My head swam and my skin turned clammy. I sensed something right behind me. The floor seemed to vibrate, or maybe it was my own shaky legs summoning what little courage I had left. I spun around, flashlight pointed into the gloom. For a heartbeat, I saw a tall, vaguely human outline looming just at the edge of the beam. No discernible features except the indescribable weight of its gaze. My stomach lurched, and I felt my heart stutter. A noise escaped my throat, a strangled half-gasp. I stumbled backward, my elbow striking an exposed beam with enough force to make my vision momentarily burst with pain. By the time I steadied myself and aimed the flashlight again, the figure had vanished, but the cold presence lingered as though it were embedded in the air around me. That was the breaking point for me, no matter what my supervisor would say. I knew I had to leave. My mind felt on the verge of collapse, and adrenaline flooded my system, pushing my limbs into motion. I sprinted back toward the elevator, each footstep echoing in a frantic cadence that seemed to mock me. The corridor felt endless, and the plastic sheets on the windows snapped and crackled in the wind like mocking laughter. My lungs burned with every breath, and my heart pounded so violently that I thought it might give out. At long last, I slammed my hand on the elevator button, jabbing it repeatedly until the doors creaked open and I threw myself inside. Once inside the elevator, I jabbed the button for the lobby, longing for the relative safety of the lit floors. Below, my pulse refused to slow and my hands trembled with residual fear as the elevator descended. I realized I was covered in sweat, my clothes damp against my skin. My mind raced with a mix of terror and confusion. Replaying those last moments in the corridor, I asked myself if it was all in my head, if the silhouette and the echoes and the footprints were manifestations of my own stress. But I couldn't shake the conviction that there was something undeniably real haunting that space. By the time I reached the lobby, I was elated. I thought about telling the security guard everything, but my tongue felt thick and useless. Instead, I just stood there, gulping in the brightly lit emptiness. A wave of relief at being off that floor washed over me, but it was tinged with lingering dread. The experience had been too vivid, too tangible. My body was still trembling. My mouth was bone dry and my heart thudded in my chest. As if it still feared something might be chasing me in the days that followed, I requested a transfer to a different floor. My supervisor seemed surprised, but didn't argue, possibly noticing my shaken demeanor. I never offered much of an explanation, only saying I needed a less isolated area. Some nights when the building is particularly quiet, I think about that 18th floor and feel a chill run through my body. It's not just a place of unfinished walls and hidden leaks. It's a place with a presence. I can't define what it is, but I know it's there, lurking just out of sight, ready to vanish the moment you try to confront it. And even though I'm away from that floor now, I still feel that presence in my dreams. See that impossibly tall silhouette waiting behind a wavering sheet of plastic. Sometimes I wonder if it was a ghost, a spirit, or simply a manifestation of my own overworked mind. The truth is, I don't think it matters. Whatever name it goes by, something unnatural haunts those corridors. I haven't ventured up there again, and I have no intention of doing so. The building's management can replace the plastic coverings, fix the leaks, and finish the renovations, but I suspect no amount of paint or plaster can rid that floor of whatever has claimed it. I've escaped it for now, but the memory remains looming in the back of my mind like a dark silhouette against a pale sheet of plastic. Watching, waiting, and ready to disappear the instant I dare to look straight at it. I felt something was off the moment I stepped onto the greasy concrete floor under the fluorescent shop lights. It was past midnight, and there I was on my second week working as the overnight watchman for a 24-hour mechanic shop. The owner had expanded his business to operate around the clock, hoping to attract stranded travelers from the nearby highway, but that highway was nearly empty after dark, so most nights I found myself alone, surrounded by silent cars and the occasional hiss of the air compressor. That night, the overhead lights seemed to cast bizarre shadows on the oil-stained floors, and my gut told me the place held secrets far beyond squeaking ratchet wrenches or squealing belts. I remember sitting in the small office near the front where a row of security monitors was mounted on a wall. The black and white displays gave me a strangely distorted view of each corner of the shop. It was quiet uncomfortably, so even the humming of the refrigerator in the break area felt distant, as if it belonged to another dimension. My boss had told me to keep an eye on the cameras and stay awake to greet any customer who might roll in. But I had realized by the third shift that few vehicles ever showed up after midnight. Occasionally, a blur-eyed trucker would pull in, but for the most part, the building was mine alone, and that solitude made every subtle noise echo in my ears like a warning. My job was straightforward: watch the monitors patrol the perimeter every hour or so and occasionally handle quick fixes. Like a tire pressure check or a fluid top off the pay was surprisingly decent for a night shift, which I'd attributed to the boredom factor until I started seeing lights flicker around the far corner of the yard where we stored wrecked and abandoned vehicles. At first I assumed it was just the reflection of passing headlights on the highway. After all, the road was a stone's throw away and the angles seemed right, but the flickers didn't always line up with a car passing. Sometimes I'd be gazing at the monitors and see a flash, but no sign of any vehicle. It was enough to make me get up and do a quick check outside, though nothing seemed out of place. The yard itself stretched behind the main garage, mostly enclosed by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Inside were rows of twisted metal husks, half-dismantled sedans, rusted pickup trucks missing doors, and other forlorn scraps. They were awaiting disposal or parted out for any salvageable pieces under the dim glow of the single overhead pole light. Those ruins of automobiles resembled the carcasses of mechanical animals left to decay in the cold night air. Most nights I avoided that area unless I needed to rummage for a part. The flickering I saw on the monitors made me want to avoid it even more, but my curiosity and duty led me to venture there with a flashlight. More times than I'd like, one of the first nights I distinctly remember noticing a bright flash from the corner of my eye on the camera feed. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough to catch my attention. I glanced back at the monitors, expecting to see headlights, or at least the beams of some vehicle rolling in. But the screen showed nothing but the same static rows of junk. I kept staring, waiting for movement. Nothing. A minute went by in silence, and I felt my heartbeat quicken, a low hum of anxiety circling my thoughts. Finally, I decided to step out there myself and check. As soon as I opened the back door, the rush of night air made my lungs contract. It carried the scent of burnt rubber and old grease. My flashlight beam swayed across the gravel path as I advanced, scanning the ground for anything unusual. I circled the entire area, peering through broken windows of the old vehicles. Shadows seemed to shift inside the cabs, but I blamed that on the glare of my flashlight. I kept hearing faint metal clinks as if a wrench were being gently tapped against steel, yet I saw no one around. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind nudging a loose scrap. That rational explanation felt hollow, but I used it as a crutch to keep my nerves from boiling over. By the time I returned inside, my hands were slightly shaking from the tension. My palms were sweaty, and I realized I'd been holding my breath on and off the entire time I was out there. Over the next few nights, those flickers of light became more unpredictable. Sometimes they appeared early in my shift. Other times I wouldn't catch one until near dawn. There was no pattern, no single cause I could pin down. I started to grow paranoid. I checked the yard lights to make sure they weren't malfunctioning, but all of them were either turned off or operating normally. I tried to see if reflective surfaces in the scrap heap could be catching moonlight, but that didn't explain how bright these flashes were. It reached a point where I began to dread glancing at the security monitors, fearing that I'd see another pulse of light with no obvious source. One night I was finishing some paperwork at the front counter when I glimpsed a sudden burst of illumination from the monitor that faced the back fence. It lit up. The inside of one of those old cars clear enough for me to see. For just a split second, I shot upright, nearly knocking over my coffee cup. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. This time, the light looked distinctly like it came from inside the battered sedan, not just around it. Every hair on my arm rose and the skin on the back of my neck prickled. I rushed over to the large bay door and wrestled it open. My adrenaline surging outside. Everything was dark again, not even a hint of that brilliance I'd witnessed on the screen. Seconds before, my breath came in short, sharp puffs and my knees felt unsteady as I took cautious steps across the gravel. I approached that particular sedan, which was missing its front bumper and had a shattered windshield. The driver's door was slightly ajar. I shone my flashlight into the interior. Expecting, I'm not sure what I expected. Honestly, the seat cushions were torn and the upholstery was stained with old grease and debris. Otherwise, it was empty. I felt my throat tighten, a suffocating wave of unease pouring over me. I slammed the door shut in an almost frantic gesture, as if to lock something in or keep something out. I wasn't sure which. Then I half-jogged back to the main building, my pulse still thudding in my ears. When I told my boss indirectly about strange lights, he shrugged it off. Remarking that maybe passing cars from the highway cast weird reflections, he told me not to worry unless I found evidence of trespassing. There was a hint of amusement in his voice, as if he considered me overly jumpy, but my instincts continued to scream that something was wrong. The nights dragged on, and my sense of dread only intensified as a kind of self-imposed test of sanity. I began writing down the times I saw the lights. I'd scribble them in a small notebook, noting their length and location. There was no discernible pattern, no single time slot that recurred or repeated. They flared up in random sequences, sometimes faint, sometimes bright enough to make me gasp. The shop's interior started to feel more oppressive, even though nothing physically changed. I'd sit there staring at the monitors, fighting the urge to constantly check over my shoulder. Those faint mechanical noises I heard outside also became more insistent. They would start as an erratic series of metallic taps. Then I'd notice scraping sounds, as though someone were dragging a piece of metal across the cement. A few times I stepped out with a wrench in hand just in case, but I never found anyone. Each search ended the same way. Me returning to the office, nerves on edge, sweat clinging to my forehead, convinced there was some hidden presence just beyond my flashlight's reach. Eventually, my growing paranoia took a toll on my body. I noticed my breath would quicken at the slightest noise. My mouth went dry whenever I passed by the yard door. I was losing track of time. My hands began trembling whenever I looked at the camera feed. The stress twisted knots in my stomach. I was hyper-vigilant, unable to relax, always imagining movement in the dark corners or behind the half-assembled engines. I even started questioning my own reflection in the shop's glass walls. I'd see my face and flinch at the wild, tired eyes staring back. One particularly eerie moment occurred around 3:00 in the morning. On my 8th shift, I was walking past one of the station bays when I caught a glimpse of what I thought was a reflection in the side mirror of an old van. At first, it looked like a vague human silhouette, but when I moved closer, it vanished. I inhaled sharply. Stumbling back, my heart hammered in my chest, and a cold bead of sweat rolled down the side of my face. I leaned in again, shining my flashlight directly on the mirror. Nothing, it was just a smudge of grime, but for that half second I could have sworn I saw a figure lurking behind me the next day. I asked a coworker during the quick overlap of our shifts if he'd experienced anything strange in the yard. He shook his head and said he hadn't noticed anything, but he added that one of the old vehicles had a rumor attached to it, something about an electrical glitch that caused the headlights to flicker. Unexpectedly, he suggested that might be the cause of the lights I was seeing, though he had no concrete proof. That rumor gave me a small lifeline of logic to cling to. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. The flickers I saw never quite looked like headlights, and they came from various spots, not just one. Still, I latched onto that explanation in desperation, hoping to maintain some semblance of reason. Another week crawled by. My anxiety grew so thick I felt like I was swimming in it. The flickers continued in that random pattern, and the metallic sounds became an almost nightly occurrence. At times I thought I heard faint whispers, but that could have been the air compressor or the wind sneaking through the cracks in the wall. My brain latched onto every possibility to keep the idea of an intruder, or worse, a supernatural presence at bay. In those nights, I felt my sanity teeter on the edge. Then came the night that almost broke me. It was just after 2 a.m. I was in the office, half dozing in my chair, lulled by the constant buzzing of the overhead bulbs. Suddenly, the monitor that showed the row of dented sedans erupted in a violent flare of light. It wasn't just a flash. It was like a strobe pulsing a few times, bright enough that the entire camera feed went white. I jolted awake, adrenaline crashing through me so hard my vision momentarily blurred. My heart thumped in my chest as I stared wide-eyed at the screen. Slowly, the brightness faded, revealing the cars again in their usual positions. But one detail had changed. A particular sedan's trunk was now open. That trunk had definitely been closed before my legs felt like they were made of cinder blocks. When I forced myself to head out there, my flashlight trembled in my grip as I stepped carefully around the scattered debris in the yard. Gravel crunched under my boots, each step echoing in the silent darkness. The night air was thick, carrying a faint aroma of gasoline. I approached the sedan with the open trunk. The lid was raised high as if someone had forcibly popped it. I shone my beam inside and saw nothing of note, just a spare tire, some broken plastic, a layer of dust. Yet I felt a wave of dread that went beyond rational explanation, as if something intangible were looming around me. The temperature felt colder near that trunk. My teeth chattered and I realized I was trembling all over. Suddenly, from behind me, a wrench clattered to the ground. The sound was so sharp I nearly dropped my flashlight. I spun around, shining the beam wildly. I saw no one. Just a rusted truck with its hood ajar. My breath caught in my throat as the beam of the flashlight quivered over the vehicle's silhouette. I took a tentative step toward the wrench on the ground. It looked old, covered in rust, as if it had been lying somewhere in the yard for years. Had it simply fallen off a ledge or a car's engine block, possibly? But in that moment, every nerve in my body screamed that it was meant for me to find, meant to scare me or warn me or something equally horrifying. I couldn't stand there anymore. My heart slammed against my ribs and my body was on the verge of panic. I whipped around and made a beeline back toward the garage. Once inside, I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against the wall, sweating, feeling the undeniable thud of my own pulse. I questioned whether any of this was real or if I was losing my mind from the tedium and isolation, but the open trunk, the wrench, those were real, tangible signs that I wasn't just imagining lights and sounds. I spent the rest of that night in near constant motion, pacing back and forth through the shop, occasionally flicking the lights on and off, as if that might reset the building's energy. Each time I caught my reflection in the windows, I looked gaunt and frantic, like a cornered animal. Every creak of metal or groan of a distant engine made me jump. Whenever the security screens flickered from the occasional glitch, my stomach lurched, expecting another burst of impossible light. Morning eventually arrived. The sky turned a muted gray before the first hints of pale sunshine filtered in. My relief shift came in, and I told him without much detail that I'd had a rough night. He gave me a puzzled look but didn't press. I didn't want to sound unhinged. Instead, I hurried out of there. the tendrils of dread still clinging to my mind as I drove home. The entire day I couldn't shake the feeling that the shop's atmosphere had seeped into me, leaving behind a residue of unease. I returned the following night determined to keep it together. My plan was simple: do my rounds, document any unusual sightings, and avoid letting my imagination run wild. The first couple of hours were uneventful then. As expected, I noticed a faint flicker from one of the monitors. No big flash, just a small pulse of light near the fence line. I decided to face it, hadn't if I could prove there was nothing physically there. Maybe I could sleep easier. I marched outside, my breathing deliberately steady as I neared the fence. I heard a metallic whisper, a barely audible scraping. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to keep going. Then I saw it, a faint glow, like a single weak headlight emanating from behind a stack of dented steel doors. I edged closer, my flashlight bobbing over the ground. My stomach twisted in knots. Every step kicked up dust that swirled around my feet. The glow began to fade as I approached, so I quickened my pace. By the time I rounded the pile of doors, I found nothing. Just the cold fence, some scattered tools, and absolute darkness. My beam revealed no footprints but my own. That was when I sensed movement behind me. I spun around, bracing for an intruder, but instead of a person, I saw something like a twisting silhouette of light, slithering between two cars, vanishing. Around a corner, my heart hammered so violently I thought it would burst. I yelled out a shaky warning, though it was more a plea than a threat. Sweat streamed down my forehead and my mouth went desert dry. My instincts shouted to leave, to run, to never come back yet. In that surreal moment, I wanted to see it clearly. I can't explain why I managed a few steps toward the cars where I'd seen that luminous form. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. Its beam danced across rusted fenders and shattered windows. The air felt thick, stifling, and I struggled for breath. Then I heard a low rattling sound from within a nearby trunk, like something scraping to get out. I can't describe the horror that washed over me. My vision blurred at the edges and my knees went weak. I took one trembling step forward, but then the rattling stopped. Absolute silence followed. No more lights, no more sounds. Just the drone of my own ragged breathing. That was enough. I retreated, practically stumbling over my own feet as I sprinted back to the safety of the garage. Once inside, I double-locked every door I could and flicked on all the overhead lights. I sat there in the fluorescent glow, forcing air in and out of my lungs, waiting for the clock to crawl toward daylight. My mind swirled with questions. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was there something truly unnatural lurking in that junkyard? When the sky finally brightened, I clocked out without speaking to anyone. I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I wasn't willing to continue facing that oppressive darkness or the malevolent presence I felt, swirling among the rusted cars. Whether it was a haunting, a trick of the mind, or some bizarre electrical phenomenon, I didn't care. It had burrowed into my psyche and refused to let go. I didn't quit on the spot, but I gave my boss notice shortly after I told him in the vaguest terms that the night shift was too hard on me. He asked if I'd been spooked by strange noises. He half smiled as he said it, but I didn't offer any details. I just said I needed to move on and move on. I did grateful to leave that place behind, yet I still find myself haunted by the memory of those flickers of light and the sense of being watched from the shadows. Sometimes at night I dream I'm back there, hearing metallic taps echo in the distance, seeing that glow swell and pulse in the corner of my vision, never quite letting me rest. Even though I escape, the lingering dread continues. Every time I pass a mechanic shop or drive by a junkyard, my pulse races and my palms start to sweat, and I'll never forget that final image. The trunk rattling as if something inside was desperate to get out. I didn't stay to find out what it was, or if it was even real in any conventional sense. All I know is that it changed me. Something in that yard was more than just old steel and broken glass. It still feels alive in my nightmares, flickering like a silent warning that some doors and trunks are better left unopened. I felt the weight of the night press against my lungs. The first time I heard that creaking above me, it was a noise like an ancient wooden plank protesting each step. but at 2 in the morning in a deserted workshop, it resonated like a hammer blow in the silence. My heart lurched every time it happened, skin prickling with an electric tension that wouldn't quit. It was an intrusion, a breach into the sense of routine I clung to in those lonely hours. Something was up there, I told myself, though. The owner insisted otherwise. Even when he told me nobody had set foot in that attic for years, the echoes of footsteps overhead told me a different story. I started this job a few months ago, tasked with minding the machines at night in a small family-owned metal workshop. The place wasn't much at first glance: corrugated metal walls, concrete floors stained with oil, and an open layout with welding benches at the center and the rear, hidden behind steel shelves stacked with raw materials. There was a narrow wooden staircase leading up to a heavily padlocked door. The owner always kept it locked, claiming it was just a storage loft crammed with outdated parts and useless equipment. He looked dismissive whenever I mentioned a faint pounding above my head, as though he had heard it all before, yet chose to shrug it off. I understood it as his way of maintaining peace, but the brush-off only fueled my curiosity. Most nights my shift began around 10. The workshop would be deserted by then, except for occasional overtime, by day shift workers who left around midnight if they had a backlog. Once I was alone, the air seemed to grow heavier. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered with an intermittent buzz, and the cool night air seeped in through the old windows, carrying with it the scent of rust and grease. I like to work in relative quiet, just the hum of the lamps and the soft click of my protective headphones. If I ran any machine checks yet after a couple of weeks, that serenity I found so comforting was shattered by the footfalls that seemed to pace directly overhead. At first I tried to rationalize it. Old places creak, especially with shifting temperatures at night. I told myself the wood was expanding or contracting, but these were not random squeaks or the gentle popping of ancient beams. They were measured steps one after another, as if someone were walking in circles. It gave me chills, and I realized my breathing had grown shallow. My hands trembled while adjusting the settings on one of the metal presses, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine. Each time I looked around the workshop, all I saw was empty space, silent machines, and half-finished metal frames waiting for final welding. There was nowhere else the sound could come from except that locked attic. I confronted the owner, indirectly mentioning I heard weird noises and asking if someone had permission to use the attic at night. He responded in a calm but dismissive tone that nobody had been up there in ages. He didn't elaborate, and I decided not to press the subject further still. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something about that loft was deliberately hidden. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every time I glanced toward those stairs, they stood like a dark invitation, the overhead bulb rarely casting enough light to see the dusty rungs clearly. The locked door at the top, always in partial shadow. I made it a habit to end my routine checks early, just to sit as far from the stairs as possible, busying myself with tidying up or adjusting inventory logs. The trouble was, the workshop was never truly silent. When I turned off the main machines, the building itself seemed to come alive with faint groans, metallic pings, and especially that inexorable creaking overhead. My chest would tighten and I'd feel my heart racing. Whenever the footsteps started, some nights it was just a single step, like a partial weight gently pressed against an old plank. Other nights it was a slow, deliberate pacing. My hands would grow clammy and I'd wipe them on my work pants, trying to chase away the dryness in my mouth. Sometimes my vision felt shaky, as if my peripheral view was distorting in the dimly lit corners. Each breath tasted stale and hot, as if I were suffocating on my own apprehension. After a month of this, I decided to drown out the noises I brought. Headphones, heavy, industrial-grade ones meant to muffle machine tools, and blasted music at a moderate volume. It didn't fully block the vibrations, but it was enough to keep me from hearing the footsteps so clearly that offered some relief. But I soon discovered a new layer to my dread whenever I stopped the music or lifted the headphones. I sensed a distinct tremor in the air, a low vibration that pulsed through the building. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a throbbing wave I felt in my gut. It seemed to come from above, almost as if it were an unspoken call demanding attention. I would sit there, forcing my breathing to stay calm, yet my heart banged against my ribs like it was trying to break free. My palms grew sweaty and I'd clench and unclench my fists in an effort to keep myself grounded. Sometimes the overhead lights would flicker more intensely, plunging the corners of the workshop into deeper shadows. My reflection in the metal surfaces looked pale and haunted on a few occasions. I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape or a dark outline shifting in the periphery. Each time I spun around, adrenaline flooding my veins, expecting to find someone behind me. There was never anyone. My breathing turned ragged and I found myself panting like I had just sprinted a mile. The air felt thick as if every breath was a struggle and my mind started to spiral. I questioned my own sanity, wondered if the exhaustion of long nights was playing tricks on me. But fatigue couldn't fully explain the footprints in the dust that weren't there before, or the distinct sense of being watched. The more I tried to ignore the attic, the more it seemed to exert an invisible pressure on my psyche. The door at the top of the stairs began to dominate my thoughts. I could visualize it in perfect detail. Chipped paint, a rusted lock, and a sense of stale air seeping from the gaps. Some nights I felt an irrational urge to walk up and just open it. Consequences be damned, my imagination conjured all sorts of images. Old mannequins used for welding practice, corroded metal scraps shaped like twisted figures, or something far less rational lurking in the gloom. My entire body tensed at the thought. My heart pounded like a drum and beads of sweat formed on my temples. I fought the idea, telling myself it was best left alone. One evening I decided I had to get some clarity, so I waited until the next day to carefully bring it up with the owner. Keeping my tone casual, I mentioned the footsteps, the vibrations, and how it made me uncomfortable. He responded with a shrug through an awkward half-smile. He muttered that the place was old and made plenty of strange noises. There was something in his eyes, though, a flicker of discomfort, as though he knew more than he let on. When I asked if there was any chance an animal had gotten trapped in the attic, he simply said it wasn't possible. Describing the door as sealed shut, he told me not to worry, that everything was safe. I nodded, but my stomach twisted with uncertainty. The conversation left me more uneasy than before, as if I'd brushed against a hidden truth. He was desperate to bury that night. I couldn't concentrate on my normal routine. My nerves were frayed and my entire body buzzed with tension around midnight. I turned off the lathe and sat on a stool facing the back wall. The staircase behind me, I left my headphones hanging around my neck, in part because a strange compulsion told me not to hide from the noises anymore. I needed to confront them, or at least acknowledge their existence. A sticky sense of dread clung to every breath I took, and my sweat soaked through my shirt and patches. The minutes seemed to drag my chest, tightening whenever the building settled or a pipe rattled. Eventually, the footsteps started again, slow and purposeful. Exactly above my position, I felt them in my rib cage, my breath stuttering with each resonance. My mind spun with questions. Was it a person? A ghost, my own imagination? The anxiety was almost paralyzing my limbs, heavy as if weighed down by invisible hands. But something changed that night. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and instead the entire attic floor seemed to emit a low, irregular tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on the wood from the other side. Each tap sent a jolt through my body, making my stomach lurch. There was a hypnotic quality to it, beckoning me to investigate. I stood up on trembling legs, my muscles tight and my mouth uncomfortably dry. Step by step, I inched toward the staircase. The workshop lights flickered, casting dancing shadows around me. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back, but I felt magnetized by the steady tapping. My heart hammered so loudly in my ears I could barely hear anything else. When I reached the base of the stairs, I looked up. The door was barely visible in the dim light, just a blurred rectangle of darkness. The tapping paused, as if sensing my presence, and an eerie hush fell over the workshop. My breathing echoed in the gloom, each exhale shaky and uneven. I reached for the first step, the old wood creaking under my boot. My hands were damp and I gripped the railing to steady myself. Halfway up, I smelled something stale, a stagnant air, almost metallic, that prickled the back of my throat. My vision blurred for a second, and I had to blink to clear the haze. It felt like the entire building held its breath along with me. My body tensed, anticipating something to lunge from behind that door. I listened, but there was only silence. No footsteps, no tapping. Just the suffocating weight of the night pressing against my senses. I realized with a start that the padlock was unlatched. It wasn't hanging open, but it definitely wasn't locked. My heart thudded again, and I contemplated the possibility that the owner had come here earlier. The fear and anticipation mingled into a swirling knot in my stomach. I felt a wave of cold sweat break across my forehead as I placed a hand on the door. The wood felt chilled, and for a moment I imagined something pressing back from the inside. That single thought made me yank my hand away. My lungs burned as if I'd been holding my breath for too long. I could sense a presence on the other side, but I was too terrified to push the door open. In that moment, the overhead lights flickered again, plunging the bottom of the stairs into near darkness. Instinctively, I recoiled, nearly stumbling down the steps. My heart pounded violently, and I felt faint. The rational part of me insisted I should leave it alone, get out of there, pretend I never found the padlock unlatched. Yet the intangible lure still beckoned, summoning what little courage I had. I knocked softly on the door, the sound echoed in the confined space, and a moment later I heard a faint shuffle like something sliding across the attic floor. The presence was real. My skin crawled and my knees almost buckled. I realized I was shaking, adrenaline pumping through my veins in a heartbeat. A wave of dread flooded me. Fear sank its claws into my brain, telling me to run. And so I scrambled down the stairs, practically leaping the last few steps. My chest was heaving, lungs grasping for air as if I just sprinted a marathon. I fled toward the main exit, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the cool night air. Outside, the moonlight felt painfully bright, and the breeze on my skin felt harsh. My heart still slammed against my ribcage, and I noticed my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone. To check the time, it was only midnight. My shift technically wasn't over, but there was no way I was going back in there. Alone the next day, I confronted the owner once more, describing how I found the padlock unlatched, and heard, "Old secrets stay locked away for good reasons." His tone hinted at guilt or fear, perhaps both unmistakable movement. He listened with an inscrutable expression, then stated indirectly that sometimes there was no apology, no explanation, just a guarded acknowledgement that there might be more to that attic than old parts. I felt an undercurrent of warning in his words, as though he was telling me not to push further. I should have quit right there, but financial obligations made me stay for one more shift, determined to keep my distance from that staircase. The sense of foreboding only grew. Each machines were felt ominous. Each flicker of the overhead lights made me jump when I finally shut down the workshop around 11. I couldn't bring myself to linger. I locked the entrance from the inside, intending to leave through the back door. After a final inspection, my hands were unsteady as I signed the night log. My heartbeat echoing in my ears, a drop of sweat trickled down my temple as I headed toward the rear eyes, darting to the right. Every time I heard a clank or shuffle, all the while the attic loomed overhead like a dark secret waiting to be discovered. I passed the stairs, refusing to look up. An oppressive energy radiated from that corner, a silent reminder of the locked or perhaps unlocked door. My pulse quickened in protest. I hurried to the back door, tugged it open, and stepped out into the empty lot behind the workshop. The night sky was clouded, offering almost no light. As I turned to close the door, I felt a slight vibration under my feet, as if the entire building sighed. A chill coursed through me, and I had to swallow against the dryness in my throat driving home. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something peering at me from the back seat. My paranoia had reached a fever pitch, and I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying the footsteps and that intangible presence behind the attic door. Even with exhaustion tugging at my eyelids, my nerves were too raw to let me rest. Every shadow in my room felt like it might contain a hidden form, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Ultimately, I decided I couldn't keep doing that shift. The workshop seemed to have seeped into my thoughts, infecting my nights with the possibility that I'd carry whatever lurked there home with me. I realized that staying would force me to confront whatever was in the attic, or worse, try to ignore it until I unraveled my final shift. I simply walked in, handed the owner my resignation, and left before the sun had fully set. I didn't look back. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something in that attic reached out to me, that it wanted me to open that door sometimes. In the quiet of early morning, I relived the sensation of those footsteps resounding over my head, or that slow rhythmic tapping that seemed to taunt me. And in those moments, my heart pounds, sweat beads on my forehead, and I sense an unspoken question echoing in my mind. What would have happened if I had turned that knob? There's no comfort in that speculation, only a lingering dread that twists my stomach. I suspect the workshop remains the same. Locked doors, silent corners, and footsteps pacing in the dark above whatever is in that attic. It's still there, patiently waiting for someone else to listen. It struck me the moment I entered that hallway like an icy hand pressing against the back of my neck, even before I saw the slightly lifted edge of the canvas covering that old portrait. I could feel something was off the air. Felt too dense, clinging to my face, and I sensed a faint buzz in my ears as though the place itself was vibrating with anticipation. I remember telling myself it was just another shift at the cultural center, an ordinary night spent patrolling rooms that were all but abandoned once the guests were gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that an unseen presence was waiting for me in the dimly lit corridor, where the dust and shadows conspired to play tricks on my mind. I started working security at this cultural center. A few months ago, the building is an old mansion built centuries ago and only sporadically renovated to keep it functional. There's a grand salon for public events, concerts, lectures, small exhibitions, and that room is lively enough when filled with people, but once the last event ends and everyone files out, it becomes my responsibility to secure the rest of the mansion, the upper floors, the narrower corridors, the hidden wings that are rarely used. Those fall under my watch. The Sense Administration wants to protect the valuable paintings and other antiques stored in these areas. That means the hallways are kept in low light to preserve the paintings. The bulbs are dim and cast feeble cones of yellowish light that sometimes flicker, leaving patches of darkness in the corners. I've always been comfortable with silence, but there is something about silence in a place like this. That grates on your nerves. It's never truly silent. Floorboards creak with soft moans under ancient weight. Pipes rattle behind walls as if they're carrying whispers from one room to another. The curtains in the old office's forgotten windows, overshadowed by tall trees, sway unexpectedly when some draft snakes its way through cracks in the masonry. Even my own footsteps have a muffled quality here, like the wood is swallowing the echo before it can properly resonate. I first noticed the problem with that covered portrait. A few weeks ago, during one of my usual rounds, I passed by a row of paintings, most of them shrouded in protective cloth to shield them from dust and humidity. Normally, each cloth is tucked neatly at the edges, so no part of the painting is exposed. But that night, I saw one was slightly lifted at the corner as if someone had pulled it to take a peek underneath. I stepped closer, holding my flashlight. The corridor felt strangely cold, and I'm certain I heard a slight rasping sound, though I couldn't tell if it was the wind or a faint exhalation when I peeled back the cloth to smooth it out. Nothing seemed out of place with the painting itself. I'd seen it before. It's an austere portrait of a figure standing in a formal pose. The face partly turned toward the viewer, but in the gloom I couldn't make out any details. The only thing that struck me was the sensation that the eyes might be watching me, even though I told myself it was just a trick of the low light. I replaced the cloth and tried to laugh off the chill that crawled up my arms, but the next night I found it disturbed again. This time the cloth was folded back further, exposing almost half the painting. My heart thudded in my chest when I noticed it, a dull pounding that made my breath catch. It felt personal, like someone was deliberately tampering with that single painting. I looked around with my flashlight, checking every dusty corner of the corridor. The overhead lighting was dim, and the narrow windows let in only faint moonlight. The swirl of shadows might have concealed any number of lurking shapes. yet I found nothing. I reported my discovery to the sense coordinator the following morning. Although I kept my tone casual, it was suggested that maybe a curious visitor or staff member had looked under the cover during the day and failed to put it back properly, but the coordinator's uncertain expression hinted that this wasn't a usual occurrence. They'd never had problems with tampering before. Still, nothing had been stolen, so it didn't feel urgent. I was told to keep an eye on it, keep doing my rounds, and lock all doors as usual that night as I passed the same corridor. I half expected the cloth to be perfectly in place. Instead, it was drawn back again, this time in a different angle, like a corner had been pinched and left creased. My pulse spiked. I remember beads of sweat forming on my forehead, and the dryness in my mouth made me swallow hard as if I'd forgotten how to breathe for a second. A tingling sensation prickled the back of my neck. I forced myself to approach, slowly shining my flashlight over the rows of paintings. They were all covered as they should be, except that one. The corridor felt alive with anticipation, every shadow seeming to pulse and twitch. That was when I became aware of a soft, nearly imperceptible sound behind me. It was like the slow intake of breath or perhaps a slight hissing. I whirled around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. For the next few nights, I noticed an odd pattern. I would patrol the entire mansion, double-check the doors, corners, and windows. Everything would be in order until I reached that corridor. Without fail, the cloth on that same portrait would be disturbed, pulled up enough to reveal a glimpse of the face beneath, and each time I'd feel a distinct pressure in my chest, like my body was reacting to something intangible. My throat would constrict, and I'd hear that faint hiss or whisper right at the edge of my hearing. I started to dread that part of my shift, knowing I would find the painting partially exposed, and that the small sound like someone exhaling would brush past my ears. One evening, I tried a new tactic. I decided to patrol that corridor first. Well before midnight, hoping to catch whoever was messing with the cloth, I switched off most of the lights, leaving only the emergency bulbs, and chose a vantage point at the end of the hallway where I could see the painting without being too obvious. The wait felt interminable. The gloom pressed in on me from all sides. The only comfort was the thin beam of my flashlight, which I kept turned off to avoid giving away my position. I stood there listening. My heartbeat thrummed steadily in my ears, and I found myself straining to hear anything else. A scuff of a shoe against the floor, the shuffle of cloth, a door hinge squeaking, but the corridor remained deathly still, so quiet that my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. After what must have been half an hour, I felt a sudden wave of discomfort, a prickling behind my eyes that made me blink. Rapidly, an odd notion seized me. The painting wants to be seen. I dismissed the thought immediately. It was nonsense, I told myself. But no sooner had I quelled that notion than the corridor's overhead lights flickered, plunging me into near darkness in that split second of flickering illumination. I could have sworn I saw the cloth lift as if tugged by invisible fingers. I lunged forward, flashlight beaming. The light steadied, and I found the cloth in the exact same position, completely covering the painting. I approached it slowly, heart in my throat, scanning the hallway. My hands were sweating so much that I almost dropped the flashlight with trembling fingers. I brushed over the cloth to confirm it was, in fact, undisturbed. It was perfectly smooth. No corner folded yet. My instincts insisted something had moved. The surge of adrenaline in my veins left me shaky and alert. For the rest of the night, I barely closed my eyes. Once my shift was over, haunted by the memory of that flicker and the intangible presence I felt in the gloom. Over the following days, the activity ramped up. Doors I knew I had locked were found slightly ajar. Light switches I'd flicked off, turned themselves on my radio used to communicate with the staff, emitted a crackling static. Whenever I passed near that corridor once while walking through the main salon after an exhibition, I heard a soft scraping noise coming from the balcony overhead. Each step I took brought me closer to a feeling of dread, as if I were inching towards something that wanted me to fail, to give up and flee. The portrait incident became almost nightly. Sometimes the cloth would be lifted just an inch or two. Other times I'd find it pulled halfway up, revealing the figure's stern face. The painting depicted a person clad in dark clothing from a bygone era. Posture, stiff eyes, painted with meticulous detail. Those eyes always seemed to bore into me. Even though each time I forced myself to look, I saw the same flat expression. Yet there was a moment, fleeting but horrifying, where I swore the eye shifted a minuscule change, like the slightest tilt of a pupil as if focusing on me. With faint recognition, I started experiencing physical symptoms of stress. My heart pounded incessantly, often at random moments. My breathing grew shallow the instant I turned a corner. Sweat broke out on my forehead for no reason. Other than remembering that corner of the mansion, my appetite dwindled, replaced by a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Each night I'd arrive from my shift bracing for another sign, another manifestation of whatever was toying with me. My rational mind told me it was a series of coincidences, a problem with the old building's wiring a caretaker or staff member forgetting to properly cover the painting, but the mounting series of strange occurrences eroded that logic. I felt watched at every turn. Once near the end of my patrol, I was finishing up in the storeroom when I caught a glimpse of movement near the door. Just a quick flicker at the edge of my vision, I whipped around and saw nothing. Just a dark corridor stretching away, but I felt a chill gather along my arms and spine, making every hair stand on end. I marched back to the corridor with the painting nearly sprinting, prepared for the cloth to be disturbed, and it was more than disturbed. The covering had been flung aside, completely revealing the painting in all its grim detail. My breath hitched, a cold sweat slicked my palms, and it felt like my heart was shaking. My entire rib cage, for some reason, it was the figure's left hand that drew my attention. This time painted in a tense, almost claw-like position as though gripping an unseen object. It looked so close to reality that I half expected it to reach out and grab me. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when I started questioning my sanity. Maybe it was that night. Maybe it was the next when I heard what sounded like a low murmured voice in the corridor that seemed to whisper words I couldn't quite decipher. The hush was reminiscent of someone gently blowing into the ear of a person sleeping. I would turn quickly, shining my flashlight, but there would be no one there. Only that looming painting with its figure half hidden in shadow. I began suspecting that the building itself might be influencing me, playing on my fears each night. The mansion's corridors seemed longer, the corners darker, and the paintings heavier with some intangible weight. When I walked, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, pushing me toward that cursed portrait. My dreams became plagued with images of shifting eyes, flaking paint, and a soft breath that caressed the back of my neck. During the day, I would tell myself it was only exhaustion, that I needed rest. But at night, each time I set foot in that corridor, my senses lit up with raw fear. The crescendo came about a week ago. I was making my final round, determined to lock up and depart quickly. My heart was already racing from the moment I entered the mansion. I navigated through the main salon, up the old staircase, and into the shadowy corridor where the portrait waited. This time I felt the presence before I even saw the painting. The air was dense, almost suffocating. The overhead lights flickered again, providing only sporadic illumination. My skin prickled with electricity and a wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. When I reached the painting, the cloth was gone, not folded, not tossed aside, completely gone. My chest tightened and cold sweat trickled down my temples. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my grip, trying to steady my breath. The painting's figure seemed more vivid than ever under the feeble light. The face bore a severe expression. Lips pressed thin. The eyes were so skillfully painted that they seemed to shimmer with cunning. I felt pinned under that gaze, unable to look away at that moment. Every light in the corridor died, plunging me into total darkness. I froze, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered and threatened to go out in the suffocating blackness. I heard it distinctly, a breathy whisper inches from my ear, as if the figure in the painting stood beside me. It was a single exhalation, long and drawn out. My throat tightened so much I could barely swallow. Fighting panic, I flicked my flashlight back on its narrow beam, trembling over the painting. The lights overhead stuttered back to life, revealing that the cloth was now crumpled on the floor. something that hadn't been there just a second before. I felt a surge of raw terror. Adrenaline coursed through me, leaving my entire body taut and ready to bolt. I forced myself to bend down and pick up the cloth. My hands trembled uncontrollably and my breath came in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed for me to run to leave the mansion and never return. But with shaking resolve, I flung the covering back over the painting and secured it tightly around the edges, muttering in my head that it would stay that way. This time, a wave of dizziness crashed over me, and for a moment I feared I would collapse right there in the corridor, overshadowed by that dreadful portrait. Then, just as I studied myself, the whisper sounded again, a low guttural moan that grazed the edge of my hearing. My muscles tensed, and I felt an overwhelming urge to tear my gaze away and sprint toward the exit. Somehow I managed to regain enough composure to retrace my steps as I moved the corridor behind me. Seemed to pulse with energy as if the painting itself was beckoning me to return. My vision swam and I had to remind myself to breathe, inhale, exhale, keep walking. By the time I reached the front entrance, my knees were so weak that they nearly buckled. I locked the doors, fumbled with the keys, and stepped outside into the night air. The relief was immediate. The open space, the distant hum of city lights, the gentle rustle of leaves. It all felt like salvation compared to the oppressive force inside. I haven't reported this last episode to anyone. They'd think I'm losing my mind, or they'd laugh and chalk it up to lack of sleep. But I know what I felt that breath against my ear was more real to me than any logic or explanation could dismiss. It convinced me that something in that mansion, something bound to that portrait, is aware, and it is not friendly. I can't explain it rationally, but I feel it pulsing through the halls. Every time I step inside, I still work here. I still patrol the corridors and check on the paintings. But now I do it with a new weariness. Always wary of corners and half-lit rooms. Sometimes when I pass the corridor with the covered painting, I swear I hear that slow whisper again, trailing behind me like an echo of a nightmare. I can't quite escape. The cloth hasn't been moved lately, but I catch myself scanning the edges. Certain I'll see it curled or lifted, every nerve in my body remains on high alert, ready for the slightest shift in the darkness. I wonder if it's the building eroding my grip on reality, or if there truly is a presence lurking within those ancient walls. Either way, every night I leave with my heart-pounding ears keenly attuned to any hint of that baleful exhalation, and when I finally lock up and escape into the reassuring lights of the outside world, I can't shake the sensation that whatever hides beneath that cloth is waiting for the right moment to be unveiled again, waiting to remind me that some places harbor shadows that can't simply be explained away, or locked behind doors, and that no matter how tightly you tuck the coverings, some things refuse to stay hidden. I still remember the first moment it struck me that something was profoundly wrong. It was near the end of my usual midnight round, and I was in one of the older corridors of the student residences. The stale air smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. The overhead lights flickered to life in quick succession as I walked. The sudden brightness revealed nothing out of place, just a long stretch of pale walls and closed doors, but I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the entire building had exhaled in unison. A shiver crawled up my spine. The sensation was so intense and unexpected that I almost dropped my flashlight. Little did I know that was only the beginning. I work as a sort of night watchman in a sprawling complex of student dormitories during mid-year break. The population dwindles to just a handful of people, if any. Most rooms remain empty. My job is simple in theory. Patrol every wing, check that all doors and windows are secure, note any irregularities in a log, and make sure everything is locked up tight by dawn. It was usually quiet, just me trudging through deserted corridors accompanied by the mechanical hum of ancient ventilation systems. But this year, something changed. I can't say exactly what or why, but the silence felt heavier, more oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch farther than they did before. At first, the stranges took the form of minor anomalies, a sense that the automatic lights were turning on in corridors long after I'd left them. Even though they should have remained dark unless triggered by motion, I would check my notes and see that I had been nowhere near those hallways for hours. and yet when I entered the ceiling, lamps would already be lit, as if someone had just walked through with the entire building mostly deserted. I assumed maybe the sensor system was faulty, but a creeping feeling told me it was something else. I started noticing other signs too. The pale glow of an emergency exit sign would flicker as I approached, sputtering in and out like Morse code. Once I heard a faint clink from somewhere behind a closed door. My heartbeat ramped up and I pressed my ear to the wood. There was nothing, just the slow, methodical beat of my heart pounding in my ears and my shallow breathing. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and found the small room entirely empty. Just 4 bare walls, no furniture, no occupant, not even a stray box. The silence was suffocating. My palms felt clammy and an unmistakable tension clenched at the muscles in my shoulders. I never considered myself a jumpy person, but every nerve in my body was on alert. After a week of these tiny disturbances, I began feeling jumpy all the time. It started to affect my sleep by the time I arrived for work. Each evening I was already exhausted, and every squeak of a hinge made me jolt upright one night. As I was making my usual circuit, I glanced at my watch to mark the hour. Then, in the hush of a deserted hallway, a corridor light switched on by itself. It was about 20 doors ahead, near a section I hadn't patrolled yet. The sensor was far enough away that it shouldn't have caught my movement. My pulse quickened and I crept forward, half expecting to see a student who had returned early or some trespasser wandering around, but there was nobody. My throat went dry. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that these weird occurrences could be explained an electrical malfunction, a drafting issue that made doors clatter. Maybe even an animal that had somehow found its way into the building, but my rationalizations brought no comfort. A part of me sensed I wasn't alone in these corridors. It was as if I could feel another presence trailing me, a set of invisible eyes boring into the back of my neck. Whenever I turned to walk away a few days later, I had a conversation with my supervisor over the phone. I kept it professional, only mentioning that some of the lights seemed to activate on their own. He suggested I look into the sensor system, maybe reset some circuit breakers. I took note of his advice and decided to handle it on the following shift. Although he said he hadn't noticed anything strange on the monitors, I could tell from his tone that he thought I might be overreacting. That irritated me slightly, but I brushed it off, telling myself that maybe he was right and there was a logical explanation. The next evening, I set out with a plan to test the lights. Myself, I went to one corridor known to have sensors that triggered suspiciously. Often my flashlight beam crossed the threshold, revealing a row of closed identical doors. The floor was scuffed, and the walls had a few patches of chipped paint. Everything looked so ordinary, but I couldn't shake the sense of being unwelcome. My mouth felt suddenly parched, and my pulse drummed in my ears. I forced myself to proceed calmly. I wanted to stay and watch if the lights came on randomly, so I turned them off manually at the main switch and stood quietly in near darkness. For a moment, I was enveloped in a thick silence broken only by the faint buzz of the emergency lights. Sweat began to beat on my forehead. I could feel the damp warmth trickling down the sides of my face. My ears were prick-cricked, searching for any subtle noise. Then out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a distant sigh. It was brief and soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade. I spun around, shining my flashlight into each corner, checking every closed door. Nothing. I muttered to myself that it was just the old pipes or some freak gust of air. Yet I couldn't get that noise out of my mind before I could decide on my next move. The lights blinked back on, startling me enough that my flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. My heart hammered like it was about to leap out of my chest. The overhead glare felt oppressive, mercilessly illuminating the empty hallway. In the sudden brightness, I saw no one, no movement, no sign of an intruder. My mind cycled between relief and terror. Relief that there was no immediate threat, and terror because something had triggered those lights. At that moment, I knew I was dealing with something beyond circuit malfunctions. As the days wore on, I grew more desperate for an explanation. I tried meticulously locking certain doors, only to find them ajar. By the time I returned, I heard more sighs, sometimes from behind me as I walked, sometimes seeming to come from just around the next corner. My reactions became visceral. My legs would tense up, ready to run. My mouth went dry and a tightness seized my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I caught glimpses of shadows that didn't correspond to any object or person. They flickered at the edges of my vision, dissolving the moment I looked directly at them. One night I decided to bring a handheld camera. Even though it wasn't part of my standard equipment, I figured I could document whatever was happening. I'd review the footage afterward to see if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The campus budget lighting cast long, wavering shadows down the narrow corridors, giving everything a distorted look through the camera lens. My throat tightened each time I heard even a faint sound. I remember focusing on an empty doorframe that used to belong to a student lounge. It was a large open room with a big window that looked out onto the courtyard, perfectly normal by day, but terrifying by night. When nothing but silhouettes filled the glass, I scanned the camera across the room's interior. It was vacant, lacking any furniture because most of it had been moved out during renovation. My hand shook slightly from the tension. At one point, I thought I caught a shape gliding across the far side of the room, but when I pressed my eye to the viewfinder, all I saw were the outlines of the walls. When I played the footage back later, the camera showed only a blur in the corner. It might have been dust in the lens flare, or perhaps an artifact of the poor lighting. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more, that there was something lurking out of sight, or that my imagination had escalated to the point I was conjuring phantoms from nothing. By the third week, my nerves were frayed to the point where the slightest noise made my entire body tense. My nights became an exhausting routine of dread, walking the corridors with a pounding heart, opening doors to confirm emptiness, hearing faint sigh that seemed to move from one hallway to the next. I felt like a hunted animal in a labyrinth, uncertain of what might be stalking me. I slept fitfully during the day, besieged by nightmares of faceless figures, waiting behind each locked door at one point. I reached out to a coworker by phone. I explained in a shaky voice that the building felt wrong, that I was hearing things and that the lights were turning on randomly as if guided by an unseen hand. He suggested I file a report and request an official inspection. I hung up, half convinced that I was going mad, but also clinging to a last vestige of hope that a formal check would reveal a straightforward glitch in the system. When the maintenance team arrived in the daytime, they found no evidence of electrical problems. They walked the halls, tested the sensors, flipped the switches, and concluded everything worked fine. Part of me felt relieved that I wasn't singled out for some hidden wiring defect. Another part of me sank deeper into unease, because if the building was functioning normally, then what on earth was I experiencing that night? I forced myself to stay alert and logical. The shift went quietly at first until near dawn. I was about to finish my route when I noticed that a set of lights was on in the far corner of the basement corridor, a place I hadn't ventured for hours. My muscles tensed and I gripped my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. I walked slowly, each footstep echoing ominously off the concrete walls. The air down there felt colder, and my breath came in short, ragged bursts with every step. My heartbeat quickened, and a prickling sensation spread across my scalp as I approached the corridor. Lights buzzed overhead. The hush was broken by a faint sound, like a long drawn-out breath coming from behind one of the storage room doors. My skin broke out in goosebumps. My mind screamed for me to turn and run, but I couldn't ignore what I heard. I reached for the doorknob, heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out everything else. The metal was cold and unyielding. In my hand, I steeled myself and opened the door inside. The room was barren, no shelves, no chairs, no signs of anyone having entered it. Smelled musty, as though the air had been locked in for decades. My flashlight traced each corner, each inch of the floor empty. Then behind me came another breathy exhale so close to my ear that the hair on my neck stood on end. I spun around wildly, but there was no one there in that moment. A dizzying swirl of panic overcame me. Every muscle in my body tensed. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, and a wave of cold sweat washed over me. My breathing was so ragged it felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. I fought against the instincts telling me to sprint away, making sure I didn't leave any door unlocked in my haste. I checked the corridor once more, flicked off the lights, and double-checked that the storage room was locked. I don't even remember how I managed to climb the stairs back to the main floor. Each step I took was weighed down by dread and an unshakable sense of being followed. It was nearly dawn when I reached the main entrance. The first pale light of morning crept through the glass doors, and for the first time in hours, I felt a slight shift in the atmosphere, a hint of normally trying to reclaim the space. The building, however, still felt alive with tension. Every corridor behind me seemed to sigh in unison, as if disappointed I was leaving. I ended my shift and drove home in a fog of conflicting emotions. Exhaustion weighed on me like an anchor, and my thoughts circled endlessly around the events of the night. I couldn't deny the evidence of my own senses, yet I wondered if fatigue had muddled my perception that morning. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes before stepping into my apartment. I felt uneasy even in daylight, as if an invisible presence had followed me home. But nothing happened. No lights flickered. No strange noises, just the ticking of my kitchen clock and the distant sounds of the city going about its routine. By the time I returned to work the next evening, I was determined to confront whatever was happening. I had considered quitting, but an odd sense of resolution pushed me forward. This time, as I walked the corridors, I called out not in a frantic or overtly terrified way, but firm enough to break the silence. I asked if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. The emptiness swallowed my voice, and the overhead lights remained off. My steps echoed hollowly. I sensed movement behind me, like a rush of air brushing past my ear. My heartbeat thundered. My skin tingled with an icy burn, but I stood my ground. My mouth was dry as I forced myself to speak again. My voice trembling, there was no direct reply, only the oppressive silence of vacant rooms and shuttered windows. The corridor lights stayed dark. Slowly, I realized that for once no lights had sprung to life. Without warning, no door had creaked open. It was as if my calling out had imposed an uneasy truce. I finished my rounds without any more incidents. The tension didn't vanish, but it felt subdued, as though some invisible occupant had receded when the sun rose. I walked out of that complex with a surreal sense of having reached a standoff with something I could neither see nor truly understand. I wouldn't say I felt safe. My pulse still hammered at the slightest sound, and every shadow made me flinch. But I felt I had reclaimed some control, perhaps. Acknowledging whatever lurked in the corridors had forced it into the background. To this day, I still don't know what haunts the empty dorms at night. I continue my rounds, and while the random lights and sighs have diminished, they haven't disappeared entirely. Sometimes at the very edge of my hearing, I'll catch a fleeting exhalation behind a locked door. I'll step forward, flashlight in hand, heart racing. Only to find an empty, motionless room. I've come to realize that these encounters might never resolve into a neat explanation. There is a weight to those corridors, an unseen presence that defies logical understanding. It remains there, lurking in the silence, part of the stale air and the flickering lights. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, though it leaves a permanent knot in my stomach. Every time I step into those halls, I feel a subtle chill, like the building is watching. The question that lingers, the one I can't fully erase from my mind, is whether it's truly something supernatural or just an echo of my own fraying nerves. But in that empty space where the door locks click and the lights flicker with no apparent cause, I sense an intelligence that sends a pulse of fear through my veins. It leaves me hyper-aware, always glancing over my shoulder, and even in the calm of a new morning, that lingering discomfort follows me, reminding me that some doors once open can never be completely shut. I first set foot in the hospital's sub on a stormy Tuesday night, an evening where the flickering hallway lights seemed to hum with dread rather than electricity. The air was unbearably. Made me jump. I sensed I wasn't alone yet. No one was in sight, and then came the moment that nearly made my heart stop. From behind the sealed door, I heard the faint click of a switch being flipped. The corridor light above the door flared to life as though something inside that forbidden room had activated it. The logical side of my mind screamed that this was impossible. The door was locked with a rusted chain, the padlock thick and secure. I had examined it before even tugged at it to see if there was any give. It never budged. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, pretend I'd heard nothing. write it off as a trick of faulty wiring, but curiosity in a still, as though it carried the echoes of forgotten footsteps that never found their way out. Even then, I sensed something was wrong, as if the cement walls themselves were whispering secrets. They wished I wouldn't overhear. It was a suffocating feeling, heavy and inescapable, and I tried to brush it off as exhaustion from a long day, but the unease in my chest never quite faded. It settled there, pulsing like a second heartbeat, warning me that something lurked in the shadows far beyond my understanding. I work as an electrical maintenance technician in a small countryside hospital, the kind of place where most of the rooms go quiet after dusk. The staff is minimal, especially at night. Once visiting hours end, entire wings can feel deserted, abandoned to the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. My responsibilities cover everything from resetting circuit breakers to fixing short circuits and aging equipment. Because the hospital is old, I need to be thorough, checking every hallway, every corner. That is how I discovered the sub and the corridor. No one ever talked about on paper. It didn't exist. No official blueprint showed any extra space below the primary basement floor, but there it was, a short flight of worn concrete steps leading to a hallway lined with rusted pipes, silent as a tomb. My first impression of that corridor was more than unsettling. The overhead fluorescent panels would light up in sequence, casting a sickly yellow glow on chipped walls and flaking paint. There were times when I would notice them powering on by themselves from a distance, responding to motion sensors that shouldn't have triggered unless someone was walking beneath them, yet no one else was there. At least, no one I could see. Each time I ventured down those steps, my pulse throbbed in my ears and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. I started to dread even the thought of going there, but my job demanded that I do my rounds. During my inspections, I gradually noticed a room at the far end of the corridor, its door sealed with a thick padlock and a chain that looked older than the building itself. There was a small metal plaque near the door handle, scratched and tarnished but still partially legible. It bore the hospital's name and an unreadable date that might have indicated when the space was last in use. Yet officially, no record of this room existed. No one spoke of it, and if I ever mentioned it casually to a Sea Orker, the response was always blank confusion. Some said they knew nothing about a sealed room. Others guessed it had been closed off for administrative reasons years ago, but nobody could give me a straight answer. As weeks passed, I found myself returning there more often. My job rarely required me to be in the sub, but each time I passed by, I felt compelled to check the corridor's flickering lights. I would stand at the top of the concrete steps and watch as the sensors detected something moving below. The lights blinked on one by one as if some invisible figure walked the length of the hall, stopping at the door. At the end, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I crept down quietly enough, I would catch sight of a silhouette, a shape that vanished the moment I tried to focus on it. One night, I was asked to investigate an electrical fault near the basement storage area. It was late past midnight, and the hospital corridors above were practically silent, except for a distant beep of some monitoring machine. I wrapped up the repair quickly, but instead of heading back to the main floor, I found myself descending farther, drawn inexplicably to the sub. My heart beat faster with every step by the time I reached the bottom. I could hardly catch my breath. I felt as though the walls were inching closer, pressing down on me, suffocating me in stale claustrophobic air. Standing in the hallway, I noticed that the light above me was dimmer than usual, flickering in a rhythm that almost matched my pulse. My palms were slick with sweat, and I wiped them on my coveralls. Each small sound, a drip of water from a leaking pipe, the hiss of air through an unseen vent. Growing sense of dread propelled me forward as I approached the door. Each step felt heavier. My knees wobbled and my mouth went so dry I found it hard to swallow. I felt a primal sort of fear, like an ancient alarm in my brain telling me I was making a grave mistake. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear against the cold metal surface. At first, I could only hear my heart pounding and my unsteady breathing. Then, so faintly I almost missed it, I detected a slow scraping sound from within, as if something was being dragged across the concrete floor. All the cautionary tales of horror stories I'd ever heard rattled in my head. My body's fight-or-flight response teetered on the edge, urging me to run. Instead, I found myself testing the padlock again, fumbling in my pockets for tools. The chain was taut, the lock remained intact, yet I kept imagining some presence on the other side, flipping a switch. Waiting for me to take just one more step, a nauseating wave of claustrophobia hit me and my vision blurred. Momentarily, I felt my legs tremble and the cold sweat on my brow turned icy. I retreated, practically stumbling backward down the corridor. My breathing was erratic, shallow gasps that barely brought in enough air. I forced myself up the stairs 2 at a time and rushed onto the main floor where a bored security guard stood by the elevator doors. I blurted out something about needing to check the fuse boxes, but he just nodded absently and didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that I didn't want to explain the fear that clung to me or describe the unexplainable sounds and flickering lights. I simply needed to get away from that door. For the next few days, my sleep was fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark corridor. I replayed the sounds in my head, convinced that something about that room was not only abnormal, but deeply, profoundly wrong. My coworkers remarked that I seemed on edge. Someone asked if I was feeling ill, and I waved it off. I didn't dare bring up my experience, certain they'd think I was losing my grip. But in quiet moments, I considered the possibility that maybe I was indeed imagining things stress could cause hallucinations, right? Perhaps the faulty wiring made the lights behave oddly and I conflated normal mechanical noises with something sinister. Still, the corridor's motion sensors continued to puzzle me. I looked into their specs. Discovered they were standard infrared detectors prone to triggering if any heat source passed by. But after scanning the security footage, I found no images of movement. The cameras caught only the corridor lighting up without explanation. The staff mostly dismissed it as a glitch. But I couldn't. I needed answers late one night. I resolved to return, determined to document the phenomenon. I took a flashlight, my toolkit, and my phone to record any evidence. My heart hammered. The entire elevator ride down the basement corridor was silent as usual, but the moment I neared the substeps, the overhead lights clicked on. The feeling of being watched enveloped me like a shroud. It was as if someone or something was standing at the far end of that hallway just beyond the reach of my vision. I started filming with my phone, narrating in a shaky voice about the motion sensors and the locked door. My breathing became labored and I felt sweat trickle down my temples. Step by step, I advanced, shining my flashlight in front of me, half expecting to see a figure dart away. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit in intervals by the flickering fluorescence. When I got closer to the door, the flashlight beam landed on the padlock. It gleamed as though it had been polished since the last time I was there. My stomach dropped at the realization that it looked newer, the rust replaced by shiny metal. I tried to control my shaking hands as I reached out to touch the chain. It felt cold against my fingertips, and I heard my own ragged breath echo in the narrow space. Suddenly, my flashlight sputtered and the corridor lights blinked off, plunging everything into darkness. I let out a small gasp, my heart pounding so violently that I felt it might burst from my chest. The only illumination came from the dim glow of my phone. Then I heard it again, that faint click like a switch being toggled. Every muscle in my body tensed. I forced myself to flick my flashlight back on, and when I did, the lights overhead flickered to life again in that disorienting moment of strobing fluorescence. I swore I glimpsed a figure at the very end of the corridor, a silhouette without distinct features just standing there. It vanished the instant the light stabilized. Leaving me alone in the stale air, my knees felt weak, and a surge of pure terror coursed through me. My vision swam, and for a moment I worried I'd collapse. I steadied myself against the wall. Drawing in ragged gulps of air, every survival instinct told me to leave, but a stubborn part of my mind wanted proof, something tangible to confirm. I wasn't imagining all of this. I aimed my phone down the corridor, zooming into where I thought I'd seen that shape, but there was nothing, only the aging walls and a distant gloom unable to bear it any longer. I turned to go back upstairs, yet as I ascended, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to look over my shoulder. One last time, that was when I noticed it. The door at the far end, still locked, had light leaking out from under the threshold. A faint strip of pale brightness that pulsed as though something inside was controlling it. My stomach churned and a clammy panic gripped me. I bolted up the stairs, not caring about being quiet or rational anymore. Back on the ground floor, I struggled to slow my breathing. I felt shaky, drenched in sweat, and profoundly disturbed. I made a half-hearted attempt to report an electrical anomaly to the night supervisor, but my words were tangled and I think my haunted expression spoke volumes. He asked if I needed to clock out early and get some rest. I nodded, unable to form a coherent excuse that night. I barely slept. My mind replayed the image of the locked door, the mysterious light beneath it, and the silhouette in the corridor. I questioned my own sanity. Perhaps I had worked too many nights, spent too long in the bowels of a building that was older than most of the staff, but deep down I felt certain something inhabited that sealed room, something that defied logic and official records. Despite my dread, a twisted curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to break the padlock, fling open the door and confront the unimaginable, yet every time I considered it, my chest tightened and I was overwhelmed by the most primal kind of terror. In the end, I decided I couldn't stay in that hospital any longer. My final shift came a week later and I completed my tasks. As if in a daze, I avoided the sub entirely, deliberately ignoring the occasional flicker of the motion sensor lights on the security monitors as I walked out of the building. After my last day, a flickering glow caught my attention on the screen near the guard station. The sub-corridor lights were turning on and off rhythmically as though beckoning me for one final visit. The sight made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. My breath hitched in my throat and a shiver rippled through my body. I hurried out, refusing to glance back at the monitors. To this day, I can't decide if I truly escaped whatever lurks behind that door or if I'm simply running from my own mind. I still wake up at odd hours, my heart pounding, convinced I can hear a switch clicking somewhere in the darkness of my bedroom whenever I see a light flicker unexpectedly in my home. A stab of panic knots in my gut, and I half expect to find that door waiting for me in my own hallway. The memory of that sub remains vivid, and even now I'm not certain what was real and what was the manifestation of a mind tormented by the unknown. All I know is the next time those lights switch on by themselves, I won't be there to check, and yet the thought still gnaws at me. Something lingers in that sealed room locked away for who knows how long, and it might not be content to stay hidden forever. Sometimes, late at night, I almost wish I had forced the lock open just to banish the haunting questions, but deep down I suspect it's better not to know. Let that door remain sealed, let the darkness beyond remain undiscovered, because if it ever finds its way out, I don't want to be around to see what emerges from the very first moment I set foot in that decaying farmhouse. I felt an unsettling tightness in my chest. The air itself seemed hostile, thick with stale dust and a faint chemical odor, as though the building had exhaled centuries of neglect in a single raspy breath. The main door creaked so loudly behind me that my stomach twisted, and I found myself pausing in the silence that followed, ears straining to catch any hint of movement. I was alone, supposedly, but that didn't stop my pulse from pounding in my temples, even before I'd taken on the night owl watch job. I knew something about this place was deeply wrong. I remember how it all started with a phone call from an acquaintance who insisted there was easy money to be made out on a deserted farm off a little-traveled highway. He said the landowner needed someone to guard the property overnight. Nothing complicated, just a few weeks of security duty until they could figure out the farm's future. There had been some talk of trespassers or vandals, but nothing specific in indirect terms. The landowner warned about strange activity. Of course I was skeptical, imagining bored teenagers wandering through an abandoned place for cheap thrills. Still, I needed the cash on my first evening there. The caretaker, a wiry man with tired eyes, walked me through the house, pointing out the main rooms and corridors. He explained that most of the farmland was overgrown. The barn was locked at all times, and the only real task I had was to keep an eye on the old house. He admitted in a low mutter that previous watchmen had complained about odd noises. The caretaker didn't seem eager to discuss details, only saying that if I heard anything or noticed any trespassers, I should call him right away when I pressed for more specifics. He shrugged and said he'd rather not scare me off on the first day, that was all. No dramatic warnings or official instructions. Just a set of keys, a phone number, and a promise that he would check in. Occasionally, I soon discovered the place was worse than I expected. The main structure was 2 stories high with peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceilings. Furniture from the 1940s or 1950s littered the rooms, covered in sheets so thin they were practically transparent. Every piece of wood, be it floorboard or window frame, appeared warped with age, exuding a musty smell that clung to my nostrils. It was as if the entire house had been sealed away in a time capsule left to rot on this desolate patch of land. During daylight, the house felt eerie but manageable. After the caretaker left me with a half-hearted good luck, I explored the upstairs rooms only to find little beyond dusty mattresses and ancient wardrobes. There was an oppressive aura in the attic hallway. The boards under my feet echoed more loudly there than anywhere else, and the narrow windows offered a skewed view of the neglected fields beyond. In the distance, I could see the silhouette of the old barn, its doors heavily secured with chains. Supposedly nobody had set foot in there for months. I tried not to dwell on why the caretaker insisted on keeping it locked so tightly. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending a low whistle through the cracks in the walls when the sun slipped beneath the horizon. I switched on a single lamp in the living room. The electricity came from a generator out back, so I knew I couldn't run too many lights at once without risking an outage. The flickering yellow glow cast dancing shadows across the furniture. My eyes began to play tricks on me. I kept thinking I saw shapes moving in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, nothing was there. I tried to shake off my nerves, reminding myself that I had a job to do. Watch the front yard, monitor the deserted road, and ensure no one broke in. That was it, but the real horrors began the moment the wind died. The caretaker had mentioned the farmland was known for gusts that howled through the night. But strangely, there came an instance when the air stilled completely, as if a giant hand had smothered all breeze. I caught myself holding my breath in that abrupt quiet, and that's when I heard them soft creaks on the floorboards directly above me, as though someone were pacing in slow measured steps. I froze, heart pounding, every muscle. Tense, the steps seemed to cross from one end of the upper corridor to the other, pausing intermittently before resuming their deliberate march. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses can be noisy, expanding and contracting with changes in temperature, but this was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be some random settling of the structure. My palms grew clammy, and I could feel my pulse thawing behind my ears. I thought about calling the caretaker, but I stopped myself. Maybe I should do a quick check upstairs. It might be an intruder, or worse yet, some wild animal that got in through a broken window. So I went upstairs. Each step felt like it might collapse under my weight. Squeaking in protest, the hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow from my flashlight. At the far end, an old mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting a distorted version of my slender figure. I shone the beam around the corridor, searching for any sign of movement. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the smell of damp mold felt almost suffocating. I saw nothing and heard nothing beyond the ragged sound of my own breathing. My mouth had gone dry, and every time I swallowed, it felt like sand scraping down my throat. After I convinced myself the floor was empty, I headed back downstairs, each step echoing ominously that night. I chalked it up to my imagination or the house's mysterious quirks, but the next evening it happened again around midnight. The wind abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake, and just as before, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps in the corridor overhead. By now, my nerves were raw, my heart pounding so loud I was sure any intruder would hear it and vanish. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, but there was no reply when the caretaker asked me by phone the next day how things had gone. I told him I heard footsteps at night. He sounded unsurprised, merely telling me to stay alert and let him know if I encountered anyone. His calm reaction only made my anxiety worse. The following week, the odd occurrences multiplied. Sometimes I would catch fleeting glimpses of a silhouette through the living room's large front window. The figure always seemed to drift away toward the barn, dissolving into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Each time I'd rush outside, convinced I might catch whoever it was in the act of trespassing, but the yard stood empty. The barn's locks remained secure, and the road was deserted for miles. By the time I circled back to the house, I'd be bathed in sweat, heart hammering, convinced I was either losing my mind or being toyed with by someone who knew the property better than I did. My sleep suffered. Although my shift was strictly overnight, I found it impossible to rest during the day whenever I closed my eyes in one of the upstairs bedrooms I dreamed of. The floorboards creaking and footsteps closing in on me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat with every nerve on high alert. Convinced I heard voices whispering from the hallway, I began to doubt my senses, questioning whether the oppressive silence of the farmland had begun to warp my perception. The caretaker would occasionally check in, but his tone remained unhelpfully neutral. His only advice was to keep an eye on any intruders and call if I needed backup. No mention of ghosts or anything else, so I stopped mentioning the footsteps, thinking he either wouldn't believe me or already knew more than he let on. One particularly dark night, the wind was howling as usual, shaking the windows in their frames, then without warning that terrifying silence fell. It was as though the entire world took a collective breath and held it. My skin prickled. I nearly dropped the flashlight I was holding the moment the breeze died. I sensed a presence behind me. I whipped around, shining my beam through the living room. Nothing. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked ominously. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the corridor to my left so close it made me jump. My throat constricted and my lungs felt like they were struggling for air with my hand trembling. I advanced toward the hallway as soon as I rounded the corner. A flicker of movement caught my eye at the top of the stairs. A dark shape. No details, just a vaguely human outline drifted across the landing and vanished. My heart thundered and I had to take several quick breaths to keep from passing out. Each inhale felt shallow, laced with panic. I forced myself up the steps, my legs shaky, muscles taut like coiled springs. The corridor was as always empty, yet there was an undeniable chill in the air, an almost electric charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. After that night, I became increasingly convinced the house was testing my sanity. Strange smells, abrupt changes in temperature, sounds that defied logical explanation. It all felt orchestrated, deliberate. I started noticing an odd discoloration on one of the upstairs walls, almost like a handprint, but it faded whenever I tried to examine it closely. My reflection in the old mirror at the end of the hall sometimes seemed to smirk at me when I wasn't smiling. Small details easily attributed to fatigue or paranoia, but they accumulated until I could barely function without glancing over my shoulder. The caretaker paid another brief visit. He noticed my frazzled expression and asked if I wanted to quit. I simply told him I needed the paycheck. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to prove I could handle the job, or perhaps I wanted to solve the riddle of that place. Part of me was determined not to let a creaking house and a few shadows break my resolve. Still, every passing night took a toll on my nerves. My heart pounded whenever I heard the shift in the wind's intensity, dreading the exact moment it would stop, ushering in that dreadful quiet and the inevitable footsteps. On my last night there, I found myself fixated on the barn. Something about the glimpses of that silhouette slipping away into the distance ate at me. Why did it always vanish near the barn if everything was locked tight, determined to confront whatever was haunting my nights? I ventured outside around midnight. The sky was overcast with only the faintest starlight providing a dim glow. My flashlight's beam bounced off the crooked fence posts and the weedy path that led to the barn. Every step felt heavier than the last, my boots crunching dead leaves and stirring up stale dirt. When I reached the barn doors, the chains looked intact, the padlock firmly in place. I walked around the perimeter, carefully scanning the walls. A broken window high up near the rafters caught my attention. It was too small for a normal person to climb through easily, but the shards of glass and the rotting wooden frame suggested it might have been tampered with. I felt a sudden prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like unseen eyes were observing me from somewhere close. My stomach twisted and I sucked in a sharp breath. The weight of my own terror pressed on my lungs, making each inhale feel forced, determined to uncover the truth. I decided to return to the house and do a final sweep from top to bottom. I moved methodically, opening every closet, peering under every piece of furniture. The old paintings on the walls with their cracked varnish seemed to follow me with their eyes. By the time I reached the second floor, my chest felt tight and my forehead was damp with sweat. The hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel. I flicked the flashlight beam across the dark corners, half expecting to see that silhouette materialize again. Instead, I was greeted by silence and stillness. But then the wind stopped. The house went quiet, impossibly quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. My ears strained, and sure enough, the footsteps returned. This time, they were right behind me. Every hair on my body stood on end, and a searing jolt of adrenaline shot through my veins. I spun around, shining the flashlight into empty space, my vision blurred with panic, and for a split second I saw the figure standing at the far end of the corridor, flickering in and out of the shadows. It turned, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt an undeniable pull like it wanted me to follow. Clutching the flashlight with a shaking hand, I staggered forward. Each step made the floor creak in protest, echoing the sound of my own racing heart. The figure slipped around the corner into the attic stairwell. When I reached the base of that narrow staircase, I hesitated. A dank smell like rotting wood and ancient dust wafted down from above, coating my tongue with a bitter taste. My breath came in quick gasps, and droplets of cold sweat trickled down my temples. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I climbed at the top. The attic spread out like a labyrinth of boxes, trunks, and covered furniture. The flashlight's beam skittered across a wooden support beam, then onto a pile of old blankets. A sudden scraping sound cut through the silence, a box sliding across the floor seemingly on its own. My pulse pounded and I felt my stomach lurch. I approached slowly, perspiration beading on my brow. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Nothing moved in the attic but me. Still, I felt sure I wasn't alone in that crushing stillness. I realized the extent to which my sanity might be slipping. Was this a ghost, a lingering presence, or simply my mind conjuring horrors to fill the loneliness of this rotting house? As if an answer, a low whisper impossible to decipher, grazed my ear. My fight or flight response kicked in. I nearly tripped as I backed away. Stumbling down the attic stairs, my heart beating so fiercely that I worried it might burst, I dashed back into the corridor, half blind with terror. At that moment, I made a decision. This job was not worth my last shred of sanity. Whatever prowled these corridors, whatever lurked in that barn or haunted these walls, I refused to be its plaything any longer. I fled downstairs, grabbed my jacket, and fumbled with the front door lock. The door stuck for a moment as if resisting my escape, then gave way with a splintery groan outside. The wind was roaring once more, but it felt like a relief compared to the suffocating silence inside. I walked away that night, heart-pounding skin, clammy eyes flicking back at the house. As I imagined shapes in the windows, I left the keys in the caretaker's mailbox with a note explaining I couldn't continue even in the open air. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, couldn't dispel the memory of that shifting silhouette and those echoing steps. My breath remained shallow and ragged until I finally got into my car and drove onto the empty highway. With each mile that separated me from that Orst farmhouse, my chest loosened just a fraction, yet the dread still clung to me like a persistent shadow. To this day, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear a floorboard creak or a slow measured footstep just down the hall, and in those moments my heart thrashes against my rib cage. My skin goes cold, and I wonder if the thing I encountered out there followed me home. I never went back to that farm, but no matter how far I run, no matter how many lights I leave on, the memory of that silent wind and those phantom footsteps lingers in my mind, a constant gnawing reminder that some places are better left abandoned, their secrets kept hidden under layers of dust and time. The only true solace I found is in knowing I escaped physically unscathed, but mentally branded by the realization that there are forces we barely comprehend. And I will never forget the sense that on those windless nights the house was alive in its own terrible way, waiting for me to let my guard down so it could unravel what was left of my sanity. I still remember the first time I walked into the abandoned municipal theater at night, the moment I stepped through the rusty side door. An overpowering sense of unease smothered me like a wave of stagnant air. It wasn't merely the silence or the layered dust on the curtains. It was the way the darkness seemed to absorb every stray beam of light, creating pools of shadow that felt almost alive. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, as if the space itself was swallowing all evidence of my presence. That first impression was enough to send an icy prickling down my spine, and I knew at once that the nights ahead would not be kind to my nerves. I'm the person assigned to inspect this place to ensure no vagrants make it their home, and that no further damage comes to the structure. The city council once dreamt of renovating the old theater, but every plan was delayed, every budget cut, until eventually they left it to rot. Now it's my task to walk the aisles, check the stage, and poke around in the dressing rooms. In theory, it's a simple job. In practice, it's anything but there's something wrong with this building, no matter how many times I tell myself it's all in my head. The feeling of being watched lurks behind every gesture I make. It clings to me like a second skin. Every evening I enter through the same side entrance because the main doors have been chained shut for years. An old padlock dangles there, rust flaking off in sharp fragments, but no one has bothered to remove it. My flashlight's beam, thin and unsteady, guides me through the labyrinth of backstage corridors. The walls are lined with peeling posters from past productions, bright images of dancers and actors now cracked and faded. By time, I've often tried to imagine the theater as it must have been bustling with crowds vibrant with music. Yet what remains is only the echo, a silent mockery that resonates through the emptiness. The echo is a constant companion, repeating my footsteps, my breath, and on some nights repeating sounds I don't think I ever made. Walking through the corridor leading to the stage, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. It's never more than a flicker, an indistinct shape slipping between the rows of seats or darting behind a curtain when I snap my head around. There's only stillness. The chairs are in neat lines, all covered in a thin coat of dust, and the heavy curtains hang motionless. Yet my heart hammers in my chest every time I can't shake the suspicion that someone is tiptoeing behind me, constantly evading the narrow cone of light that stretches from my flashlight on the stage. The boards cack underfoot, the old rigging ropes sway slightly overhead as though disturbed by a faint breeze that I can't feel on my skin. My breath grows ragged whenever I remember the rumors floating around. Rumors that the place is haunted by the unsettled energies of past performers. I never believed in that kind of thing before, but I can't deny that each time I stand on that stage, an oppressive presence seems to loom just beyond the curtains, waiting for me to drop my guard. The worst part is the hush, a silence so thick that even my heartbeat echoes off the chipped paint on the walls. I usually direct my flashlight at the seats in the auditorium, scanning the rows for any sign of intruders more often than not. That's when I see it, a brief silhouette shifting near the main aisle. My pulse spikes and my breath catches in my throat. I'll train my light on the spot. See nothing but dusty upholstery, yet feel a near suffocating certainty that I've just missed catching. Whoever or whatever it was, a pang of nausea knots my stomach. Sometimes the sensation of not being alone is so intense that I whisper under my breath, demanding that the presence reveal itself. Whenever I do, a strange hush falls as if the air is holding its breath. The tension becomes unbearable. I sense a response that doesn't quite form words but resonates in the hollow spaces of my mind, like an echo of my own voice twisted by the theater's acoustics. Once I've finished my routine in the main hall, I climb the narrow staircase to the balcony. There are two sets of stairs leading up, one to the cheap seats and another to the principal box. The principal box is always my last stop because it's where I hear the faint murmurs night after night. I follow that spectral sound only to find myself confronted by emptiness. The velvet seats up there are rotted and frayed, and the place has the stale odor of an attic forgotten for decades. The moment I step onto the balcony, I feel a coldness that surpasses the rest of the theater's chill, penetrating through my jacket and nestling against my bones. The hairs on my arms stand rigid. My flashlight illuminates the void, revealing only dusty floors and battered seats. Yet that barely there. Murmuring persists, hovering at the edge of my hearing. A muted conversation impossible to decipher. I recall one particular night when the sky outside was a sickly orange from the city's light pollution. The hallway leading to the principal box seemed more claustrophobic than usual. My mouth was so dry I could taste the dust on the back of my tongue. The sensation that someone was directly behind me was so overwhelming that I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly in the gloom. The air moved behind me, or so I believed. My heart pounded so hard that I swore it might burst. Then just beyond my range of vision, there was a nearly inaudible shuffle. For the longest moment, I stood paralyzed, my skin burned hot and cold. At the same time, every logical part of me insisted I was alone, yet the primal fear coursing through my body said otherwise. I felt a faint brush of air against the side of my neck, and every muscle in me went rigid. My arm jerked, the flashlight beam quivering across the walls by the time I gathered the courage to aim. It behind me again, only stale air occupied that space. My insomnia grew from that point onward. It's not that I couldn't sleep because of the job's irregular hours. Rather, it was the knowledge that each evening I would return and confront those intangible presences lurking in the corners of my vision. I tried talking to a colleague who briefly helped with the theater's security before quitting. He implied that he'd also heard strange things, though he laughed it off, saying maybe the old building was just settling. He claimed to have no recollection of seeing shapes or silhouettes, but something in his eyes hinted that he was holding back. He left me with a vague warning that it was easy to let one's imagination run wild in a place so layered with history and isolation. Determined to retain my sanity, I began a personal routine, walking slowly up and down every aisle, shining my flashlight at each seat, scanning methodically and gently pushing aside the curtains in the backstage area to confirm nothing was hidden there. I would then double-check the sound equipment, which was half dismantled and covered in thick plastic sheets. The wires snaked across the floor, reminding me of black tendrils coiling in the darkness. The reverb of my own shuffling steps in the audio booth became an almost demonic resonance, as though the room itself groaned in agitation. Each time my flashlight flickered, a common occurrence with these old batteries, I found myself sweating, my heartbeat pounding behind my eyes. Convinced I was about to see something that defied explanation, even when the light steadied. The fear lingered like a dense fog around me, but it was the principal box that refused to let me rest night after night. The faint murmuring continued, sometimes accompanied by light rustling sounds as if fabric were dragging across the floor. I started to question whether my mind was playing tricks. Was it the building's acoustics? Some small critter nesting behind the walls, making sounds that I interpreted as voices. I hoped for a rational explanation, but each new night chipped away at my skepticism. The murmurs grew less random, almost rhythmic. Sometimes I caught the distinct rise and fall of what might have been a voice too distant to parse words, but undeniably human in cadence. Yet I found no footprints in the dust, no signs of entry, no scattered trash that might indicate squatters. The seats were always undisturbed, save for the thickening dust. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I decided to confront the mystery directly. My flashlight in one hand, a portable work lamp in the other. I climbed the stairs to the principal box with my heart racing so fast I felt faint at the threshold. I placed the lamp on the floor, switched it on, and let its bright glow flood the dilapidated space. For the first time, I saw the box in glaring detail, peeling wallpaper, cracked ceiling. The tattered velvet of the seats, dust particles swirled in the air, illuminated in sharp detail by the lamp's beam. The murmuring stopped abruptly, as if startled by my intrusion. I stood there, each breath jagged, waiting for my ears to adjust to the sudden hush. My whole body was trembling and sweat dripped down my temples. I strained to hear even the faintest hint of that voice, but the silence remained absolute. Then out of the stillness, I perceived an echo of my own labored breathing. It wasn't a mere reflection of sound. It carried an alien quality that both resembled my breath and simultaneously distorted it into something else. It felt like a presence, actively imitating me, as though mocking my fear. My throat went tight and a surge of panic seized me. Everything within me screamed to flee the box, to run down the stairs and out the door. Yet some stubborn part of me refused. I inched forward the lamp, casting my long, trembling shadow across the decaying seats. My mind buzzed with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. I couldn't decide which was worse. The idea that I was imagining all of this, or that something malevolent truly lurked there in that moment. I shut off the lamp and stood in darkness once more, letting my eyes adjust. My intention was to catch any movement in the gloom to surprise whatever might be hiding for what felt like hours. I stood perfectly still, adrenaline pumping through my veins, every muscle tensed. Then the shadows shifted only a fraction of an inch, but enough to make my stomach twist into knots. The faint, nearly inaudible murmur began again, close enough that I could feel it reverberate in my chest. My entire body shook with dread, my breath quickening to shallow gasps. I forced myself to raise the flashlight, my arm quivering, and directed it toward the source of the sound, but the beam revealed only an empty row of seats that was the tipping point. The oppressive weight of uncertainty and fear exploded inside me. My heart thudded so loudly I thought it would reverberate against the walls. My knees threatened to buckle and a cold sweat drenched my back. I stumbled out of the principal box, knocking the work lamp over in my haste. The crash of metal hitting the floor reverberated with a hollow ring in the hallway. I nearly tripped down the stairs, hands gripping the rails so hard my knuckles turned white. The entire theater seemed alive. Then the corridors groaned, the stage ropes creaked, and in the distance I swore I could hear footsteps racing to keep up with me. But every time I whipped around, there was no one there when I finally burst through the side door into the open air. My lungs gulped the chilly night wind as if I'd been drowning, and only now reached the surface. My hands trembled uncontrollably and my mind spun with questions I couldn't answer. Had I just come face to face with something supernatural, or was this nothing more than the unraveling of my own nerves? I couldn't decide. Even my sense of relief at escaping felt tainted by the knowledge that I'd have to come back the next evening. To this day, I can't fully explain the events in that theater. I still perform my inspections, albeit with caution bordering on paranoia. The council hasn't given me any new information, so I have no choice but to continue in silence. Every trip inside feels like entering a labyrinth of echoes and shadows, and I never know what I'll encounter in those unlit loves. The memory of that murmuring in the principal box returns whenever I'm alone, making me question my grasp on reality. Was it my own echo warped by failing acoustics, or something older and darker? Feeding on my fear, I'm left with a gnawing certainty that the theater is more than just an abandoned building. It might be a conduit for energies we don't understand, or perhaps it's become a reflection of my own anxieties, magnified by darkness and isolation. Whether the thing that lurks among the seats is real or a manifestation of my unraveling psyche, I can't deny the persistent dread that coils in my gut. Each time I stand on that stage or pass through the back corridors, I sense it watching me from behind the curtains, just out of sight. Every rustle of fabric, every creak of the floorboards, even the echo of my own breath becomes a harbinger of something that should not be, and so I remain locked in this unsettling dance with an invisible partner, uncertain if my next step will reveal the truth or push me deeper into the darkness. Whatever lies in the shadows of that forsaken theater, it has made its claim on me, and no amount of flickering flashlight beams can banish the haunting presence I feel. Each night, I still remember the first time the elevator door slid open on the 9th floor, revealing that darkened corridor soaked in an unsettling hush. There was something off about the air itself, thick as though it was resisting every step I took. The overhead lighting in that south wing triggered by motion. Sensors flickered and hummed erratically, creating the sensation that the building was resisting my presence as much as I was dreading it. Even before I stepped out, my pulse was already racing and every breath felt labored. That night was only my second week on the job, and it marked the moment I realized that the building, with all its mid-century grandeur and neglected hallways, was more than just an old commercial structure. It was a place where the past lingered, seemingly refusing to let go of the present, and where something unseen might be watching. I work as a night watchman from 10 at night until 6 a.m. The building itself dates back to the 1950s, and most of the original interior remains intact in the older, less frequently used sections. Each evening, I collect my flashlight, secure my keyring, and mentally prepare for 8 hours of strolling through a place that feels like it has never fully adapted to the modern world. On any given night, the majority of the floors are empty, with only one or two occasionally occupied by IT staff or people burning the midnight oil on urgent projects. Apart from those few individuals who usually keep to themselves in their offices, the entire building belongs to me and my imagination. For those late hours, it didn't take long for me to notice that the 9th floor was different. The first time I felt it was during my routine rounds. I stepped onto the floor, shining my flashlight along the corridor. The faint glow revealed tarnished metal handrails, chipped paint on the door frames, and the once polished wooden panels that lined the walls. A strange hush followed me as I walked, but from the corner of my eye I kept seeing flickers of light where no movement should have triggered them. My heartbeat quickened, my skin prickled. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to old wiring or faulty sensors. However, each subsequent visit confirmed the same pattern. The lights flickered as though something darted from office to office. I told myself it was an electrical glitch, but deep down I could feel a tightening in my chest and a dryness in my throat whenever I approached that south corridor, like my body was responding to a threat before my mind could process it. During one round, I had paused in front of a locked office to check my clipboard. Verifying the door was indeed secure in that moment, I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing behind the frosted glass window set into the wooden door. It was quick, just a dark silhouette crossing from one side to the other. My muscles tensed, my palms grew clammy, and I felt a chill trickle along my spine. After a moment of shock, I tried the door handle, finding it locked as expected. I stepped back, heart pounding against my ribcage, breath coming in shallow bursts. I checked the security system on my phone for any record of entry. There was nothing, not just that night. No one had swiped into that floor for the entire week. Aside from me, the next day I mentioned it to my supervisor, indirectly reporting that perhaps the sensor logs weren't updating properly, or there was some malfunction with the door. He accompanied me to the office, and we unlocked it together under the glare of fluorescent lights. The following afternoon, everything was pristine. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. My supervisor took notes and suggested the system might need an update, but his dismissive shrug hinted he believed I was just imagining things. I tried convincing myself that my eyes had played tricks on me, that maybe the headlights of a passing car outside had cast a bizarre reflection, or I'd simply spooked myself. But every new shift reinforced my growing discomfort. I noticed that the scuffed floors in the corridor sometimes bore faint smudges that seemed to appear overnight, as though someone had been wandering around on another evening. I heard a soft scraping sound. Just as I rounded the corner to the restrooms, my throat constricted and the hairs on my arms stood on end. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like a chair being shifted across the floor in a vacant office. When I mustered the courage to check, every office was dark and locked. As the weeks went on, the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavier on my chest. The sensation of being watched was no longer a passing feeling. It became a constant presence, especially between midnight and 3 a.m. when the building was at its quietest. I'd step off the elevator and my heart would thunder in my ears. My flashlight beam would tremble slightly from the unsteady grip of my sweaty hands. Every step along that corridor felt burdened by an unseen gaze. I could practically hear my pulse echoing in my head, competing with the faint hum of old air ducts. Strangely enough, the north side of the 9th floor never gave me any trouble. It was the southern stretch, a row of offices that had changed little since the 1950s, that exuded this suffocating unspoken tension. The walls were still clad in dark walnut panels that had begun to warp with age. The thick carpeting, a drab brownish gray, had never been fully replaced, so it muffled my footsteps but also seemed to absorb every bit of light from my flashlight. At times it felt like the building itself was swallowing me up. I tried strategies to cope. I found that listening to music through headphones sometimes helped in the earlier part of my shift. Whenever I reached the 9th floor, I had to take them out. Some primal instinct demanded I keep my ears open, as though I needed every sense on high alert. My ears would strain in the silence, picking up the faintest creaks and distant rumbles from old pipes, which in turn fueled my growing paranoia on nights when staff were in the building. I felt slightly less alone, but they rarely ventured beyond their offices on the lower floors, and I never confided in them about my experiences. It seemed pointless to scare them or label myself as the guy who jumps at every flickering light. Eventually, the experiences escalated one particular night as I was walking that dreaded hallway. The motion sensor lights behind me turned off, leaving only the fixtures above me illuminated. Then, without warning, the lights 3 offices ahead flickered on, even though I was too far away to trigger them. My stomach lurched and I could feel my heart racing carefully. I made my way forward, conscious that my breathing had become raspy as I approached each door. My flashlight revealed only dark, vacant interiors through the narrow panes of glass. Yet the lights continued to come on in sequence, one set after another, leading me down the hallway as if some invisible presence was guiding me or taunting me. Every muscle in my body felt like it was wound tight. My throat was so dry that it hurt to swallow. It got to the point where I reached the last office at the end of the corridor, an older conference room rarely used anymore, and stood there in apprehension. The sensor light above the door was flickering. I placed my hand on the doorknob, feeling a tremor course through me. The doorknob turned easily, but the door itself was stuck as though something on the other side was holding it. I pushed lightly and suddenly it gave way. I stumbled forward and nearly dropped my flashlight. The beam revealed an empty room with a long, dust-covered table in the center. The musty smell of stale air assaulted my nose. Once I was inside, the flickering light overhead steadied. For a moment, there was no explanation for what had just happened. No reason for the door to be blocked, and then suddenly not. My mind raced, and an acute sense of unreality began to sink in. Was I dealing with something supernatural, or was my exhaustion warping my perception? That question became persistent, gnawing at my sanity. After that unsettling episode, I started hesitating before stepping off the elevator onto the 9th floor. I'd stand there, hand hovering over the panel, heart pounding, telling myself not to let fear control me, but inevitably I had to do my job. One night I tried a different approach. Instead of walking straight down the corridor, I stepped quietly, almost tiptoeing, to see if I could catch whatever was causing these disturbances. By surprise, my pulse throbbed in my temples, and I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead. Slowly trickling down into my eyebrows, the overhead fixtures detected me turning on in slow intervals. Yet I got the impression there was a shape or presence moving just ahead, slipping out of sight. The moment the lights flickered on, my mouth went dry and a slight tremor passed through my legs. My flashlight trembled as I scanned the closed doors, each labeled with a rusted nameplate from a bygone era. Again, that gentle scraping sound emerged from somewhere in the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was followed by what I can only describe as a soft footstep on the carpet. I called out a greeting more, a cracked, hesitant echo of a greeting, but there was no reply. My own voice sounded alien in that space. Lost in the thick silence, I never saw anyone, but the atmosphere felt predatory, like I had wandered into some territory that did not belong to me. The corridor seemed longer, the corners darker. My heart pounded so furiously that I struggled to keep my breathing steady as I passed one closed office. I heard a faint click from within, like a light switch being toggled. When I directed my flashlight through the small glass panel, I saw only darkness and my own reflection. Then a thought crossed my mind with startling clarity. Perhaps I was being watched from inside the room, observed just as clearly as I observed my own reflection. That realization twisted my gut, and I moved on in a rush. Unwilling to stay near that door for a moment longer, the final straw came on a night when I found that every sensor light on the 9th floor was blinking in a sequential pattern from one end of the corridor to the other, as if they were waving me forward with my pulse hammering in my chest. I followed that macabre path, each step taking me closer to that last office. At the far end, the door was slightly ajar, even though it should have been locked. My flashlight revealed a yawning blackness inside. Inching closer, I felt a wave of clamminess wash over me, as if I were crossing into a region untouched by time. Inside was a single desk, an old wooden thing with curved legs set below a fluorescent light that sputtered on as I approached. The drawers were all half open. My breath caught in my throat. All around me, I felt a sensation that was akin to static electricity. Fine prickles dancing along my arms, accompanied by a low hum I couldn't quite place. It felt like the building itself was alive, swelling and contracting with each of my hesitant breaths. In the suffocating hush, I discovered an old key resting on the desk's surface. It was heavier than modern keys with an ornate bow, the metal tarnished with age. I could feel my heart pounding behind my ears as I held it. Something in my mind whispered that this key unlocked more than a door. It might open the final threshold between the present and whatever restless force lingered in this place. Every logical instinct in me said to leave it, but a morbid curiosity drove me to take it in my hand. The moment I did that, faint hum rose to a static buzz and the overhead light flickered violently. I felt a surge of panic rattle my nerves. My breathing turned shallow and the entire corridor behind me seemed to darken at once, as though the sensors had collectively failed. Only that sputtering light in the office remained, casting long warping shadows across the walls. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure reflected in the dusty window behind the desk, a tall, dark outline that didn't match my proportions, swaying slightly as if it were waiting. My heart jumped and my body reacted on pure instinct. I lunged for the door and rushed into the corridor. The key clenched tightly in my palm. My legs felt weak, almost buckling under the weight of terror and adrenaline. I sprinted for the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly when the doors finally slid open. I dove inside, jamming the closed door button as though my life depended on it. The elevator descended with its usual slow hum, but it felt like it was taking forever. In that moment, I was convinced something was in that corridor, pressing against the sealed elevator doors, trying to follow me. When the doors finally parted in the lobby, I stumbled out, panting, my body slicked with sweat, my mind reeling, my vision swam with a mixture of relief and residual fear. I spent the rest of that shift in the security office downstairs, occasionally glancing at that old key I had left on the desk, uncertain if taking it would bring something more menacing upon me or if leaving it there had sealed my fate anyway. I haven't returned to that corridor in the same way. Since now I make my rounds, but I pass through the 9th floor. Swiftly my body tensed as though bracing for a collision. I still sense it there, the flickering lights, the drifting shadow, that choking sensation in the air. I know that I'm not alone in those hallways, whether it's some lingering presence from the building's past or a figment of my own unraveling psyche. I can't shake the notion that I've opened a door I can never fully close, even now as I step off the elevator and steel myself for the short trek to check the southern corridor. My entire body is coiled tight and sweat beads on my upper lip. A persistent tremor lives in my hands. My breath catches at every sudden flicker, every creak, every subtle shift of darkness. The building hums around me, the old pipes and aging electricity forming a dissonant chorus. I used to dismiss these occurrences as symptoms of a faulty sensor system or an overactive imagination, but now I'm convinced that something lingers there beyond the locked doors and dusty corridors. Feeding off my fear, I haven't told anyone the full extent of these events. The supervisors don't seem interested in ghost stories, and any colleagues who might listen would probably think I'm unraveling. Maybe I am. But each night I feel that presence looming, pressing against the edges of my vision, toying with the flickering lights, reminding me that this building, with all its history and neglect, has become more than just a backdrop to my nightly routine. It's become a labyrinth of unseen truths, a place where time and memory have curdled into something malevolent. I don't know how much longer I'll last. Here, part of me wants to quit, to step away from this place and never look back. But another part, that same morbid curiosity that made me pick up that key, insists on pressing forward. It insists there is a truth to be uncovered, something that explains the watchful eyes, the phantom footsteps, the lights that flicker without reason. For now, I endure each shift as best I can, breath catching in my throat whenever I hear the floorboards creak or see a shadow cross a locked door each time I insert my key into the elevator panel for the 9th floor. My pulse accelerates and a bead of cold sweat forms at my temple, and so it continues night after night. a quiet psychological war between what is real and what might be lurking just out of sight. I'm locked in that battle heart pounding with each new step into the corridor, uncertain if I'll ever find relief, but equally uncertain if I can escape the building's hold on me. The only thing I know for sure is that my life, once filled with routine and monotony, now feels forever on the cusp of revelation or insanity in that uncertain space. I wait night after night, listening to the faint hum of the lights as they flicker on and off, reminding me that something waits in the darkness, something that's made a home in the stale air and shadowed halls of that looming ninth floor. The moment I first stepped into that gutted restaurant, I felt an unsettling heaviness in the air that refused to dissipate. The floor was scattered with planks of wood-chipped tiles and half-open cans of paint, all of which gave off a sharp chemical odor that reminded me of too many late shifts on construction sites. Something about this place made me feel instantly uneasy, like I'd walked into a room where a terrible argument had just taken place. The lights overhead were dim, flickering annoyingly as if they might go out at any second. And despite the stale air, I could almost sense the ghost of bustling activity, like echoes of clanging pots, sizzling pans, and the low murmur of conversations that had once filled this space. There was a biting edge to the silence, now broken only by the faint hum of the stripped wiring in the walls. It was an atmosphere charged with tension, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to stir. I had been hired to watch over the place at night to ensure that no one broke in to steal the tools and materials left behind by the renovation crew. It was supposed to be a simple job: show up when everyone else was leaving, walk the perimeter every hour or so, and keep an eye on the equipment. I wasn't even required to stay in one spot. In theory, I could have sat in my car outside, but I had instructions to make. Sure, no one was lurking around inside, especially in the kitchen area where the most expensive gear was stored. The pay was good enough for me to accept the weird hours. Plus, I told myself I'd seen stranger gigs, like the time I had to guard a vacant office building that had a broken elevator that kept opening on its own. I tried to brush off my initial apprehension, as nerves still something about the emptiness of that restaurant and its darkened corridors kept my skin crawling. The first few nights were tedious, but mostly quiet. I'd arrive around midnight, flip on a few overhead lights in the main hallway, and set up my small portable lamp near the entry, creating a make-do workstation. The rest of the building would remain cloaked in shadows, the flickering bulbs illuminating odd corners in a way that played tricks on my eyes. About 2 hours into the shift, I'd begin hearing those soft knocks coming from the direction of the old walk-in freezer. It sounded so distinctly like knuckles rapping on a solid wall talk that I couldn't blame it on machinery or the typical pops and groans of a settling building. And yet each time I worked up the nerve to investigate, I found nothing more than a dark, empty storage area, the hinged freezer door wide open and no sign of any disruption. I'd shine my flashlight across the walls, checking to see if a loose panel might be the culprit, but everything seemed secure. It was as though something or someone was deliberately tapping, just to make me come over, only to vanish. The moment I arrived on the third night, I noticed a mirror placed at an odd angle on the long prep counter in the kitchen. It looked like it had been there for ages, gathering dust. It was large, with a tarnished frame that suggested years of use. Sometimes when I walked by in my rounds, the overhead light would catch on its surface just right, and for the briefest moment I think I saw movement in the reflection. At first I chalked it up to my own silhouette crossing the kitchen, but twice I could have sworn I spotted something else, something behind me that disappeared the instant I whipped around. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear my pulse in my ears. Each time I thought I saw that flicker of motion, a low wave of cold dread washed over me. My breath would become shallow and I'd feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I told myself it was exhaustion, that a mind left idle in a silent building will start weaving illusions. Still, the unnerving sensation lingered, making me doubly alert as I paced the halls by the fifth night. I was growing accustomed to the sporadic knocks near the freezer, though they still set my teeth on edge. I'd begin my watch by checking every corner of the restaurant thoroughly. Reassuring myself that I was alone, the building was designed with multiple dining rooms, each with its own distinctive decor, though it was all half torn down now. exposing the skeleton of what had once been a stylish Aerie. I'd walk through them, feeling the dry dust cling to my boots and the sense of desertion creeping along my spine. Then I'd move into the main kitchen, a large space with metallic counters and overhead racks. Meant for pots and pans, many of those racks were empty. Now the pots collected in a dented pile on the floor by the pantry door. Still, the tension in the room was oppressive. The single functioning fluorescent tube in the ceiling made everything look washed out and sickly. Its faint buzzing filled the silence in a way that felt almost aggressive, drilling into my head until I wanted to scream just to break the monotony of that noise one night. As I was fiddling with some electrical cables near the entrance, I heard the distinct clang of metal hitting metal from the kitchen. My mind instantly jumped to the conclusion that a trespasser had broken in to steal the leftover equipment. My heart throbbed in my chest like it wanted to escape. I sprinted toward the source of the commotion, adrenaline spiking through me. When I got there, I found nothing. The battered pots were still in the corner, undisturbed, and there was no sign of forced entry or anyone else present. I shone my flashlight across the counters, the cold steel reflecting back at me, but there was no other movement. It was a silent, chilling emptiness. The only evidence I had of something unusual was the echo of the clang still resonating in my ears. My breath was ragged and my skin prickled with goosebumps. It felt like stepping into a vacuum where reality warped and left me stranded, unsure of my own senses as the nights wore on. Paranoia began gnawing at my sanity. It started small, the feeling of being watched whenever I bent down to pick up a tool or rummage through a box of cables. I could practically feel eyes boring into the back of my head. But the moment I straightened up and spun around, there was no one. Other times I'd pass by that mirror and catch a glimpse of a shape, some kind of dark outline standing just outside my field of vision. Each time I looked directly, the shape would dissolve into the gloom. At one point, I even thought I saw the reflection of a pale face behind me, distorted by the mirror's tarnished edges. My throat went dry and my palms broke out in a cold sweat. I had to shut my eyes for a moment to steady myself, and when I looked again, the face was gone, leaving only the reflection of my own trembling figure under the harsh fluorescent light. Lack of sleep began to wear me down. My mind kept replaying every small anomaly. The knocks, the glimpses of movement, the echoing clang of pots on an endless loop. My chest would tighten with anxiety whenever I stepped into the building, as if an unseen presence was pressing down on me. Draining the air from my lungs, I started doubting my own recollection of events. Maybe the knocks had a rational explanation. Perhaps the movement in the mirror was just a trick of the light, or maybe the pots had just shifted due to some vibration. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize these experiences, I couldn't shake off the primal fear that something was terribly wrong here. My heart raced every time I entered a dark corridor. My hands trembled and my vision sometimes blurred at the edges, like my body was ready to snap into fight or flight mode. Without warning, the final straw came one night when I was conducting my usual round in the corridor leading to the walk-in freezer. The faint overhead bulb kept flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then I heard it talk louder than before, as if the knocks were right next to my ear. My entire body froze. My lungs seized up and I felt a chill race down my spine. Summoning what courage I had left, I stepped toward the freezer door. It lay ajar like a mouth waiting to swallow me. I reached out with my flashlight, its beam quivering because my hand wouldn't stop shaking inside. It was just darkness broken by the circular reflection of my flashlight on the walls. The temperature was cool but not freezing, and every surface looked damp and unwelcoming. Then, from somewhere in that darkness, I heard what sounded like a faint exhale, almost a sigh. My chest constricted and I stumbled back, feeling my heartbeat thunder in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was my own breath echoing in the enclosed space, but I didn't believe it. I slammed the freezer door shut, nearly dropping the flashlight in the process. My heart was pounding so violently that I felt dizzy. A wave of nausea rolled through me and I thought I might pass out right there. Instead, I forced myself to move because the one thing more frightening than running was standing still. I practically bolted into the main dining area. The light was dim, and in the reflection of the windows, I could see my own panicked face. My vision blurred at the edges, and I found myself gasping for air. I tried to calm down by reminding myself that I'd been alone in plenty of spooky buildings before, that I was just letting my imagination run amok in a deserted restaurant with a weird vibe, but reason had no hold on me anymore. My entire body screamed that I was in danger and that I needed to leave, yet I couldn't abandon my shift. I had a job to do. So I studied myself and decided to end the night's rounds with one final check of the kitchen. My logic was simple: if I got through this last sweep, I could haul up by the entrance until morning. That was the plan, but as I stepped back into the kitchen, I noticed that the old mirror on the prep table had shifted. It was tilted more upright than before, revealing a broader reflection of the room. My pulse hammered and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to walk toward it. With each step, the mirror seemed to magnify every shadow, every speck of dust dancing in the stale air. I could see the large metal counters behind me in the reflection, the ceiling light flickering above, and the empty racks that once held pots. Then in a jarring instant, I saw that shape again, a dark silhouette standing just beyond the door. My stomach twisted and my breath caught in my throat. I spun around to face it, directly nearly dropping the flashlight. But the doorway was empty, just the cold gloom of the corridor behind it. When I looked back at the mirror, the silhouette was gone. A creeping sense of dread slithered up my spine, and for a moment I felt like my limbs were made of lead. I'd had enough. My nerves were shot, and the oppressive atmosphere was suffocating. I backed away from the mirror eyes, darting to every corner of the kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. The overhead light flickered again like a mocking stutter. Every muscle in my body told me to run to escape. I rushed out of the kitchen past the dusty dining room chairs stacked against the walls and found my way to the main entrance. The door felt stuck as I tried to push it open, and for a split second, panic seized me. It gave way after a forceful shove, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I stumbled outside, chest heaving, and leaned against the brick exterior. The silence of the empty street almost felt comforting compared to the oppressive hush inside. I did return the next night, determined to face whatever was happening in that restaurant. But the tension in my body was almost unbearable as I stepped through the doors again. This time I felt a strange mix of dread and defiance. I refused to be scared off by something that had no logical right to be there. I walked the corridors more quickly than usual, double-checking the locks, scanning every inch with my flashlight. The knocks near the freezer returned, but I refused to respond. The old mirror remained on the table, reflecting only my own tense face when I dared to glance at it. Eventually, the shift ended, and I stepped out at dawn, feeling battered but oddly victorious. I had faced the swirling shadows, the eerie knocks, and the relentless paranoia, and I had survived physically at least. Yet even now, the memory of that place clings to my mind like a film of grime. Every time I shut my eyes, I recall the shape in the mirror, the echoing clang of unseen pots, and the horrifying certainty that something there was reaching out from the darkness. I'm left with questions that refuse to settle. Was it all just stress, the product of an anxious mind left alone in a husk of a building? Or was there genuinely some presence lurking among the hollow walls? Feeding on my fear, I have no definitive proof, only the echoing memories that make my skin prickle even in broad daylight. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if the next night I have to watch over an empty building, I'll face a similar presence. The possibility sends shivers down my spine, but I keep going because I have no choice. The real horror isn't what we see or think we see in the dark. It's the nagging doubt that we may never truly know what's hiding just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. And it's that lingering uncertainty that ensures I'll never forget those nights of solitary vigilance, listening to the hollow knocks on the freezer wall, waiting for a shape to appear in the mirror that shouldn't be there, and feeling the relentless churn of dread that no amount of rational thought can erase. I felt the chill the moment I stepped through the side entrance of the clinic. Even though the corridors were kept at an even temperature, there was a penetrating cold that snaked across my skin and settled deep in my bones. My first few nights on the job had been relatively calm. Sterile hallways, humming fluorescent lights, the occasional drip of a faucet that needed fixing. But as the clock approached 3 a.m. on my second week, an unmistakable dread began to gnaw at me. It was as if the building itself were exhaling a slow, freezing breath, warning me that something was off. That was when I first noticed the door at the end of the corridor silently opening and closing on its own, as though beckoning me deeper into the gloom. I had been hired to cover the night shift in a medium-sized medical clinic, one that officially closed to the public at 8 p.m. Only a few overhead lights remained on for basic visibility. They created pockets of yellowish glow in an otherwise dark space. My responsibilities were straightforward: supervise the generator, ensure that any essential equipment remained functional, and make certain no unauthorized persons wandered in it. Sounded simple enough, the pay was decent, and I appreciated the solitude, but I quickly learned that solitude can play tricks on a man, especially when the environment does half the work for you. After my first few nights, subtle occurrences started to pile up, each one leaving me a bit more unsettled. It began small one night as I walked the corridor that connected the waiting area to the main examination rooms. I heard a faint click. I paused, thinking it might just be the heating system or some leftover mechanical noise. Then I heard it again, another distinct click. It reminded me of the noise a latch makes when a door closes. I turned around and saw that the internal door leading to the exam rooms was swinging gently, the handle rattling ever so slightly. At first, I convinced myself there was a draft. I checked every window in the hallway, found them all locked. I adjusted the thermostat, thinking maybe a change in air pressure was responsible, but the door continued to move in that subtle, unsettling way. After a while, it stopped, as if it had never moved at all. The corridor was quiet again, but my pulse was racing and my hands felt clammy. I refused to let my mind jump to irrational conclusions. It had to be a simple mechanical glitch, I told myself, or perhaps the building settling. But as the days passed, the oddities intensified. A week later, I started noticing soft murmurs coming from the direction of the nurse's resting area. This was typically empty at such a late hour. With the staff gone home hours earlier, the hum of voices was barely audible, like a conversation muffled by thick walls. I strained my ears, trying to pick out words or even the cadence of real speech. Yet every time I moved closer, the sound faded into an untraceable hush. Convinced I was not imagining these noises, I decided to record them. I placed my phone on the counter outside the nurse's station, set it to record, and walked away. When I played the file back, it was nothing but static and whispers too garbled to understand. I couldn't dismiss it outright. It was there, but it made no sense. Even the background hiss had a sinister edge to it. Like a breeze blowing through a crypt, my temples pounded with the realization that something was happening. Beyond the edges of my rational explanation, the strangeness reached a turning point when I began seeing quick flashes of light in the corridors. They were never constant or even predictable. Sometimes I would be in the break room sipping stale coffee, and a flash would illuminate the hallway through the window on the door just for the briefest second, as though someone had flicked a flashlight on and off. Other times I'd be standing in the corridor itself, completing my rounds, and my peripheral vision would catch a strobe-like flicker against the wall. I checked the clinic's log and the emergency lighting system, but everything was in working order. The spare flashlights were locked in a cabinet that I alone had access to at night. On one occasion, I even rushed toward the source of the flicker, expecting to find faulty wiring or some reflection from outside, but there was nothing, just the sterile emptiness of a place not meant to be occupied at those hours. As these incidents grew more frequent, I felt my own body betraying me under the weight of anxiety. My throat would go dry each time I heard the slightest noise. My fingertips would grow numb with pins and needles when I turned a corner, expecting the corridor to be empty, but fearing it might not be. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that sometimes I thought the clinic was pumping it through the ventilation system. Each breath felt like a stifled plea for reassurance. I tried sharing my concerns indirectly with one of the day shift supervisors. I mentioned that the door near the exam room seemed to have some issue with its latch. I hinted that perhaps the electric wiring in the corridors might need a once-over. Given the unexplained flashes, he listened politely, or at least pretended to, but seemed dismissive. He suggested the building might be old and joked that I was probably tired from adjusting to nighttime work. When I pressed about the static-laden recordings, he shrugged and said that electronics can pick up all sorts of interference. There was no direct confrontation, but I left that conversation feeling more alone than ever, convinced that no one would take my growing terrors seriously. The real trouble started in the early hours around 3 in the morning, when the entire clinic seemed to shift into a different personality. The lights that were meant to stay on would dim in a strange, irregular pattern, as if the clinic were breathing my reflection, and the glass doors of the waiting room would appear distorted slightly. Elongated, the hum of the HVAC system seemed to adopt a fluctuating pitch, producing an almost melodic moan during one of my rounds. I stood still in the hallway for a moment, holding my breath, and realized I could feel vibrations through the soles of my shoes, like a low-frequency resonance that you might expect from heavy machinery. The generator was 2 floors below, but this was different. Pulsing, rhythmic, almost alive. One especially unnerving night, I noticed a shadow crossing the corridor in front of me. It happened so fast that I nearly doubted my own eyes. The silhouette was tall and leaned slightly forward, as though peering around a corner before disappearing. My heart jolted so violently that I felt it might tear through my ribcage. With sweat gathering on my forehead, I sprinted to the intersection of hallways, half expecting to confront an intruder, but no one was there and no door was open. The entire space was silent, but for my own ragged breathing echoing off the sterile walls. In those moments, I questioned whether I was losing my grip on sanity each time I tried to rationalize a new experience. The clinic threw another inexplicable phenomenon my way. One night, I discovered footprints in the dust near the generator room. They were faint and seemed to appear out of nowhere, ending abruptly as if the person had vanished into thin air. Another time, I became convinced I could smell antiseptic in the main hallway, an overwhelming, pungent odor like the entire corridor had been freshly scrubbed with chemicals. Yet there was no sign of recent cleaning, and the smell dissipated. The instant I tried to trace it, my attempts to maintain composure often failed. I could feel the sweat rolling down my back. Even in the climate-controlled environment, my breathing became shallow whenever I heard the slightest creak. The overhead lights would flicker, and my vision seemed to flicker with them. More than once, I thought I caught a glimpse of a figure in a lab coat down the corridor, but each time I blinked, it was gone. This wasn't a place that felt safe anymore. It was as if the clinic were a living thing, reacting to my fear, feeding on it. I found myself so tense that I would jump at the clang of a mop bucket in a distant janitorial closet, or the mechanical sigh of a door at the far end of the building. One of the most disturbing nights came when I decided to approach the exam room door that had been opening and closing. It was around 3:10 a.m., and I felt a sense of dread that went beyond anything I'd experienced. Up to that point, there was a flicker in the fluorescent lights, and that door was again swaying slightly. An eerie invitation. My stomach felt twisted, as though someone had knotted it from the inside, and I could taste bitter acid at the back of my throat. I inched toward the door, each step accompanied by the squeak of my rubber soles against the tile floor. The corridor felt impossibly long, and I could have sworn the door was receding further away, as if the hallway were stretching itself out to keep me from reaching it. When I finally stood in front of it, I placed my hand on the handle. It felt cold and strangely damp, like it had been sitting in a freezer. Slowly, I pushed it open, the exam room behind. It was dark, illuminated only by a faint glow seeping through the blinds from the streetlights. Outside, my heart thudded so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. The room seemed empty, just an examination table, a sink, some cabinets for medical supplies. I stepped inside, convinced I would find nothing but a draft or maybe a misaligned hinge. Then I heard a soft shuffle from a corner. I froze. My scalp prickled as though every hair was standing on end. My vision blurred momentarily, mustering courage. I pointed my flashlight into that corner. There was no one there. Only a metal stool and a rolling tray, yet the stool was turned slightly as though it had just been moved. My breath came out in a ragged gasp. I stepped backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and fled the room without looking back. Ever since that night, the sense of oppression in the clinic deepened. Even the silence felt loaded, like it was vibrating with a hidden message. The faint whispers near the nurse's station returned almost every night. If I tried to record them, I heard only static on playback. The door at the end of the hallway kept swaying. Even after I tightened its screws, the corridor light sometimes blinked in what felt like a deliberate sequence. Not just random power fluctuations, worse. I would occasionally catch a reflection of movement in the polished floor tiles. When I was positive I was the only one in that hallway, my hands would shake involuntarily. Whenever I tried to steady my flashlight, I began to doubt my own senses to the point where I feared turning corners or opening doors. The anticipation of seeing something impossible, some figure crouched against the wall or a silent shape standing in the middle of a room, ate at me. Every moment I told myself I was just paranoid, that the job was too solitary, that perhaps my mind was conjuring illusions out of stress, but the physical manifestations, the temperature drops, the swaying doors, the footprints, the hushed voices refused to let me cling to rationality on my final night working there. I felt an overwhelming urge to confront whatever was lurking in those corridors. I couldn't endure the silent torment anymore. As 3 a.m. rolled around, I forced myself to walk the entire clinic, from the empty waiting room to the supply closets, from the exam rooms to the far corners of the basement near the generator. The deeper I went, the heavier my limbs felt. My heart was pounding so fiercely that spots danced in my peripheral vision. The overhead light seemed to flicker in rhythm with my pulse. Each corridor felt more oppressive than the last, and the air had an indescribable weight, as if I were wading through a tangible darkness. When I reached the generator room, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. The door was ajar, and I heard a low droning sound coming from inside. Not just the hum of the generator, but something layered beneath it. My scalp tingled and a cold sweat erupted on my forehead, summoning what little courage I had left. I entered the generator's status lights blinked as normal, but the corners of the room were swallowed in shadow. I'm not sure what I expected to find: a person, a trick of the light, some hidden speaker. Instead, I was confronted by an almost crushing sense of presence. My lungs constricted and my breathing became ragged. The walls seemed to close in for a moment. I thought I might pass out from sheer terror. Then in a single blink, the sensation vanished. The droning stopped. The room was simply a room again, lit by a single overhead bulb. But my entire body was shaking, and I knew I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I slammed the door and stumbled back upstairs, shutting off lights and double-checking locks far more. Hastily than usual, my car keys felt slippery in my hand as I fumbled my way to the side. Exit. The night outside was calm, far calmer than my own mind. I took one last glance back at the clinic for a second. I thought I glimpsed a flicker of white light behind one of the second-floor windows, but I refused to linger. I got in my car and drove away, my heart racing with the adrenaline of escape. I never returned to that night shift. I gave my notice the following morning, citing personal reasons. Even now, when I drive past that building, I feel a pang of dread that shoots straight through my chest. My breathing becomes shallow and my fingers tense on the steering wheel. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else experiences the flickering lights or hears those distant murmurs. Perhaps it all stopped once I left, or maybe the clinic just found a new late-night caretaker. Someone else it can lure into the labyrinth of its silent halls. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that whatever existed in those corridors is still there, waiting in the darkness, opening and closing doors for the next person who dares to walk its halls alone. And every time the clock strikes 3 in the morning, I'm certain the building draws in a quiet, malevolent breath, an invitation or perhaps a warning echoing through those deserted corridors. Long after I've gone, I still remember the chill that swept through me the first time I set foot inside that vast concrete labyrinth. The clock on my phone had just ticked past midnight, and the silence was so absolute that each step felt like a trespass. Something in the stale air warned me that I didn't belong there, that the shadows clinging to the walls were not mere absences of light, but watchful presences. My pulse hammered in my ears as I made my way through the lobby for my very first shift. Little did I know how profoundly that place would get under my skin and how each night would intensify a creeping dread. I couldn't explain away I had been unemployed for months when I finally took this maintenance job in a sprawling residential complex. The place was massive with multiple towers jutting up into the night sky like silent sentinels. Each had its own set of potential issues: water pump failures, power outages, jammed trash chutes, problems that often manifested during the witching hours. The pay was decent and I was desperate, so I didn't hesitate to accept the graveyard shift running from midnight to 6 a.m. At first, I convinced myself that the stillness of the night would be easier to deal with than the chaos of daytime. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and I could focus on my tasks without having to worry about residents hovering around me. That was before I discovered the tower labeled 7. Even now, just thinking about its looming silhouette sets me on edge. The building manager vaguely mentioned once that Tower 7 had an unreliable electrical system prone to strange surges and random flickers. He claimed it was nothing more than outdated wiring, and poor insulation brushed it off as a nuisance that often required a reset in the breaker room. But there was something in his eyes that made me wonder if there was more to the story. He averted his gaze as though recalling events he'd rather not articulate during my first week. The radio crackled almost every night, alerting me to a sudden power failure in Tower 7. Always the same floor, often the 10th or 11th, and always the same time, 2 in the morning. Give or take each time, I would do as trained trudge to the building's exterior door, climb into the echoing stairwell, and find nothing. The lights would be on, the hallway would be empty, all circuits would be functioning perfectly. My attempts to troubleshoot were fruitless. But the radio alerts kept coming by the end of that week. Just the thought of stepping inside Tower 7 set my nerves on edge. I rationalized the creeping fear, told myself it was simply stress from being alone in an unfamiliar environment. But a few nights later, I heard something that still causes my skin to prickle when I recall it. I had received yet another intercom call about lights going out on the 10th floor, annoyed but obligated. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs. Footsteps echoing in that cramped concrete chamber when I reached the 9th floor landing. I felt a tug of apprehension. My heart thudded, sweat beaded on my forehead, and my throat went dry. Then I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, one step at a time, as if someone was walking in sync with my own pace, but maintaining a level above. For a second, I thought it might be a resident returning from a late-night errand, concerned they might need help or could be disoriented in the dark. I rushed up the final flight. My flashlight beam darted across the walls and the door to the 10th floor corridor. Nobody was there. I thought perhaps the person had quickly gone inside an apartment, but the hallway was dead silent. The tension in my chest made it difficult to breathe. I forced myself to check the breaker box, only to find everything in order. No circuits tripped, no burnt smell, no flickering lights. The building system was perfectly normal. On my way back down, I realized my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. My legs felt weak, as though the stairwell itself was pulling me in with each step, urging me to turn around to go back up. It was an insane thought, but I couldn't shake it. I managed to leave the building, but long after I returned to my small maintenance office, I couldn't dispel the sense of being watched. Things didn't get easier during the rounds outside. Either the complex's parking structure sprawls beneath the towers with a labyrinth of concrete pillars and dim overhead lighting. At the far end of this subterranean lot sits a storage room filled with spare tools, replacement pipes, and maintenance odds and ends. The moment I cross into that area, a faint scraping noise rises above the hum of the fluorescent lamps. It's a soft, eerie sound like metal, rasping over metal, steady and persistent. I once spent nearly half an hour trying to locate its source. I checked loose grates, examined vents, tested every tool on the racks. Nothing yet. The sound persisted, always seeming to come from a spot just out of reach behind some shadowy pillar or within the bowels of the wall. Each time I'm down there, my pulse skyrockets and sweat makes the collar of my shirt cling to my neck. The back of my skull tingles, and it feels like if I dare to turn around too quickly, I might catch a glimpse of something or someone standing behind me. The uncertainty is maddening. One night I spoke with a security guard who was on his way out, and he suggested that perhaps the underground levels pipes were old and rattling underwater pressure. I didn't argue, but I sensed he was just making excuses. Maybe he'd heard something too and wanted to rationalize it. I didn't exactly confide my deeper fears. Instead, I kept them to myself, certain I'd be mocked for letting my imagination run wild. After all, I needed that paycheck letting on that I was unnerved might have threatened my ability to keep this job, so I moved on, ignoring the sense of dread each time the elevator's fluorescent lights flickered or the radio blared to life with another phantom call. One of the most jarring incidents happened about a month into this routine. I was in the main office when the intercom panel chimed again, and a mechanical voice announced an electrical failure in Tower 7 ground floor. My heart sank. I braced myself and headed out. The night air was oddly still, and every window in the entire complex seemed to watch me make my way to that ominous entrance. I pushed the lobby doors open, stepping onto a marble floor that glowed faintly under emergency lighting before I even reached the front desk. The elevator doors slid open by themselves. At first, I thought a resident might be inside, but it was empty. Its overhead light flickered in an unnerving staccato pattern, taking a cautious step forward. I peered at the buttons on the panel. They flashed randomly as though an invisible hand was pressing them in quick succession. Then everything went dark. I felt my breath catch, and a cold wave washed over me, the kind you get when terror grips your throat and refuses to let go. A moment later, the lights returned as if nothing had happened, trying to remain logical. I reasoned that the old wiring was at fault, but my body refused to accept that simple explanation. My palms were clammy and my knees wobbled as I decided to head to the electrical room on the 10th floor to check the breakers. This time I chose the elevator both to save time and to confront my fear. The ride was excruciatingly slow. The lights in the elevator flickered periodically, and with each flicker, the reflection in the stainless steel walls seemed to shift, almost as if it showed not just me, but some blurred outline standing behind me. I avoided looking too closely. Focusing on my own ragged breathing, when the doors opened, I jumped out, half expecting to see the hallway plunged in darkness. Yet everything was illuminated in a soft, almost comforting glow. My relief was short-lived, though, because the silence pressed in on me from every angle. It felt unnatural, like the floor itself was holding its breath. The breaker room was a small closet at the end of the corridor. Opening the metal door produced a shrill creak that reverberated so loudly I nearly yelped inside. I inspected the breakers one by one, all normal, no surges, no triggers. My heart pounded so violently that I felt it in my temples. Then from somewhere behind me, I heard that dragging footstep again. It was faint, a soft scuff on the linoleum. My entire body went rigid, and I could barely muster the courage to pivot. When I finally did, flashlight raised. There was only a vacant hallway, still the air felt charged, like an invisible presence was standing inches away, challenging me to take a single step in its direction. I couldn't stand there any longer. I bolted for the stairs, ignoring the wave of vertigo that nearly made me stumble each flight down. I heard something following me, not a person, but more like a whisper of motion at the corner of my perception. My own breathing sounded thunderous in my ears, and my throat was so tight it hurt. By the time I reached the ground floor, my uniform was drenched in sweat. Unexpectedly, the elevator was waiting with its doors open. Lights steady as ever, there was no sign of malfunction. The lobby was perfectly quiet, the overhead lamps humming softly. It was almost serene. In a daze, I stepped outside, my chest heaving as I gulped the cool night air. That was the moment I realized whatever was happening wasn't purely electrical. Something was toying with me, maybe testing my limits. I stood there trying to regain my composure, but a sensation of being watched from inside the building forced me to keep moving. I returned to the underground parking, partly to check the boilers and partly to avoid the eerie emptiness of the towers. Once there, I felt compelled to investigate the scraping noise. Once more, I headed toward that far corner near the storeroom. As I approached, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder. My nerves were already shot, so every minor sound set me on edge, making my pulse jump erratically. The scraping was there, faint and rhythmic. I followed it around a row of shelves stacked high with boxes of spare parts. The noise intensified. Suddenly, the room felt colder, as though all warmth had been siphoned out. My stomach churned as I circled a heavy metal cabinet. That's when I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped the flashlight toward it, but saw nothing. Besides my own reflection in a dented metal panel, my mind insisted something had just been there. A shape or a silhouette that moved away the instant I turned my head. The scraping sound abruptly stopped, leaving a jarring silence that felt even more ominous. I stood there, heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst. Time became a blur. It could have been seconds or several minutes before I gathered the courage to shine my flashlight across the rows of shelves behind the garbage bins and under a large table. Nothing, no occupant, no explanation for the noise. Anxiety gnawed at my insides. I wanted to call someone to ask if they had ever experienced anything similar, but I felt foolish who would believe me. Eventually, I forced myself to continue my rounds. My shift ended at 6 Igor, and the faint glow of dawn found me slumped against the wall of the maintenance office, exhausted and shaken. I tried telling myself that it had been a trying night, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew the difference between a fatigued imagination and a palpable sense of being hunted the next week followed a grim pattern. The radio still reported phantom malfunctions in Tower 7, and the moment I stepped into its lobby, odd phenomena would intensify: unexplained footsteps, flickering lights, elevator doors that opened on their own. My reflection and polished surfaces appeared distorted, as if the building itself wanted me to question what was real in the underground garage. That scraping noise grew louder, more frantic, but never allowed itself to be found. My nights became an endless cycle of clenched fists, shallow breathing, and a racing heartbeat. My paranoia skyrocketed to the point where I found myself checking over my shoulder every few seconds at one point. I even contemplated quitting, but my finances wouldn't allow it. The job, as disturbing as it was, paid well, and I was in no position to walk away. I told myself I would endure it, that I was stronger than any lurking shadows or flickering lights, yet each night chipped away at my resolve. My dreams became twisted labyrinths where corridors stretched infinitely, and faint footsteps echoed behind me. No matter how quickly I ran, one particularly harrowing night, I confronted the tension head-on. Another alert from Tower 7: ground floor lighting failure, with sweat already forming on my forehead. I entered that despised lobby the second I stepped inside. Every single bulb dimmed until the entire entrance was bathed in a faint orange glow. The elevator lights flickered, an unsteady beacon that felt more mocking than helpful. I marched across the lobby, heart hammering, determined to reset whatever breaker had tripped. That's when I caught sight of my reflection in the elevator's mirrored interior. There was the shape again, a blur behind me. I spun around instantly, but the space was empty. It felt like the building was breathing, its walls expanding and contracting in quiet anticipation. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to pry open the electrical panel in the lobby. Every switch was perfectly set. My hands trembled so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. My stomach twisted and an icy dread rushed up my spine. It was as if the entire building was mocking my attempt to find a logical explanation. Sensing that I was on the verge of losing control, I slammed the panel shut and backed away. I still don't know what compelled me, but I whispered under my breath that I wouldn't be frightened off so easily. The words felt hollow even as I said them. Something in the air shifted, a silent response that made every hair on my arm stand on end without warning. The ceiling lights flared back to full brightness. My vision swam from the sudden glare, and when I blinked it away, everything was just as it should be, quiet still and mildly lit by the overhead fixtures. But my body remained coiled, adrenaline coursing through every vein. I could practically feel my heart thudding against my ribs. In that moment, I understood that whatever presence haunted Tower 7, be it a trick of my mind or something far more tangible, thrived on my fear. It slithered through the empty corridors, lurked in the corners of the parking garage, and whispered through the flicker of the fluorescent lamps, and it wouldn't stop. Not as long as I was there. The revelation was as chilling as it was sobering. At the end of that shift, I left the building just as the sky began to lighten. My muscles felt drained and a headache throbbed behind my eyes. Yet I had survived another night. A cold breeze blew across the lot, and for a moment I looked up at Tower 7's facade. The windows reflected the dawn, revealing nothing. Still, I sensed the building was watching me just as intently as I watched it. I wish I could say I made a decisive choice that morning to quit, or to confront the phenomenon once and for all. Instead, I found myself in a stalemate bound by financial necessity, yet burdened with an unshakable dread. The unseen presence in Tower 7 knew me, now recognized my routine, understood my weaknesses. Each time I swipe my keycard at midnight, I feel its attention snap to me, waiting to escalate this twisted game. I don't know how this ends. Maybe the building eventually reveals a deeper truth. Maybe it's just my mind unraveling from the strain of working alone in the dead of night. All I can say for sure is that something out there, a scraping in the dark, a flicker in the hallway, a breath against my neck has taken root in my nights. And every time my radio crackles with a new alert for Tower 7, I can't stifle the nauseating churn in my gut. Yet I go. I always go, because for now I have no choice, and because sometimes surviving the night is the only way to make it to the next dawn. Even if that dawn brings no comfort at all, I woke to the sound of something scratching on glass. A faint, drawn-out scrape that seemed to resonate from inside my own mind. My heart gave a start thudding dully against my ribcage as I realized it was coming from the bedroom window. I sat up, my breath-shallow eyes darting toward the pale rectangle of moonlight. Nothing moved yet. The darkness felt alive, brimming with an electric tension that weighed heavily in the room. I could swear I sensed the presence of someone or something peering in that single moment. A suffocating hush, broken only by my uneven breathing, marked the beginning of my descent into a terror I never expected to witness outside of nightmares. Even now, I'm not sure which detail truly triggered this unease. Perhaps it was the bizarre phone call several weeks prior, or maybe it was the quiet but unshakable feeling that I was being watched. All I know is that my life began to twist into a slow-moving horror the instant my phone buzzed at 3 a.m, revealing my best friend's name on the screen. He had always been the practical one between the two of us, never prone to flights of fancy or superstitions. So when I answered that night, still half awake and disoriented, his urgent tone rooted me to the spot. He told me abruptly and without much clarity that I shouldn't leave my home. Under any circumstances at that time, his voice trembled with an intensity I had never heard before. Not even when we went through stressful situations in college. It felt like an order coming through gritted teeth. Then just as quickly as the call had started, he ended it. Leaving my ears ringing with that final click in the morning, I discovered that the stretch of road where I usually park my car suffered a severe electrical short. Loose wiring arced along the pavement for a good half hour, igniting small flares of sparks. Had I been near my vehicle at that exact moment, maybe leaving for some errand, it might have ended with injuries, or at least significant damage. Instead, I remained safe in bed. The coincidence was striking enough, but even more disturbing was how my friend insisted he had never made that call. He remembered no dreams, no involuntary actions. Nothing in all the years I'd known him. I had never encountered a single instance of sleepwalking or odd behavior. Yet there I was holding my phone's call log as proof that something had compelled him to contact me at an ungodly hour. I should have left it at that. A strange, inexplicable event that ultimately saved me from trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed against something beyond the ordinary. The rational side of me, a man who liked to see the world in black and white, found itself challenged. My nerves, usually calm, refused to settle. Although I tried to push it to the back of my mind, I began to sense a low-grade anxiety twisting inside my chest, surfacing every time I saw a phone at night or caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar figure at the end of the block. Things started small, barely noticeable flickers of stranges that might be brushed off as paranoid illusions. One evening, as I washed dishes, I heard a soft crackling sound behind me. It reminded me of a bad radio transmission, like whispering static. I turned off the faucet and listened intently, but the noise vanished, leaving me with a dripping sink. Another time, while brushing my teeth, I sensed a presence just outside the bathroom door. The floorboards gave a faint creak enough to make my pulse leap into my throat, but I found no one there. Rational explanations sprang to mind, pipe settling temperature shifts in the wood, but those thoughts felt hollow. It was almost as though my home had become a conduit for some intangible force. Not long after I started having bizarre dreams in them, I wandered aimlessly through my house, guided by the dim glow of lamps that never fully lit the rooms. The phone would ring somewhere in the distance, its tone echoing as if reverberating through a cave. I would roam from room to room, never locating the source of that persistent ringing. Worse yet, I sensed in those dreams that something stood just out of sight around each corner, tracking my progress. Waiting for me to pick up the call, my heart would pound in my chest, a nauseating rhythm that seemed to intensify with every passing moment. I would awaken drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Over time, the line between dream and reality grew increasingly blurred. The static I had heard while washing dishes revisited me at irregular intervals, always just quiet enough to make me doubt it was real. Some nights I was sure I glimpsed silhouettes in my peripheral vision, shadows that disappeared the moment I whipped my head around. Even the reflections in windows began to distort. I might glance at the glass and see my own face contorted by fear, but when I blinked, my features returned to normal. Despite all this, I never felt physically attacked. Instead, I felt systematically worn down by something intangible. My paranoia crept into everyday life, leaving me on edge at work. Coworkers occasionally commented that I seemed pale or jittery, but I dismissed their concerns. I knew how ridiculous it sounded telling them that a single phone call had ignited a chain of events I couldn't explain. The rational side of me demanded that I dismiss it too, yet I couldn't. It clung to me like a cold sweat. An invisible film coating my skin one night, I decided to confront the creeping dread head-on. I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, refusing to let the darkness intimidate me. The intention was to prove to myself that everything was in my head, that I could reclaim control. I had turned off my cell phone, hoping to prevent any unwanted calls or illusions of calls, and waited hours past my heartbeat and occasional thunder in my ears. The longer I sat there, the more oppressive the silence became. The house seemed to breathe around me, walls contracting and expanding in an almost perceptible rhythm. My eyes felt gritty from strain. I must have drifted into a light sleep, because the next thing I remember is a noise. A deep reverberating hum, like the vibration of phone static amplified. It seemed to rattle my bones. As I jerked awake instantly, I realized my phone was on. Even though I distinctly recalled switching it off, its screen glowed with a faint light, and the device vibrated against the coffee table. My heart hammered in my throat as I reached for it. The device's gentle buzz unspooling my nerves. The number on the screen was unrecognizable, a string of digits that made no sense, yet I felt compelled to accept the call. Something deep in me rebelled at the idea, but some other part of me, maybe the same part that refused to disregard what my friend had done, weeks ago insisted I answer with trembling fingers. I picked it up. The line hissed with static. I could hear frantic breathing, but it wasn't mine. It sounded like an echo of someone else's fear bleeding through the phone. Fast and ragged for a second, I thought I recognized my own voice in that labored breath, almost a reflection of my panic. Then the phone went dead. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought I might faint. I sat there, cold sweat running down my temple, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. It was only me in the dark, phone in hand with the house pressed around me like a living shroud. That night I slept with every light on my sense of helplessness noted at me, turning the next day into a disorienting blur. Work offered no respite. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, uncertain whether I wanted to see another call or not. The tension in my chest continued to gather momentum. I didn't trust my own senses. The passage of time felt slower, and a single crack of a knuckle in a nearby cubicle made me flinch. I tried to confide in my friend, the same friend who supposedly called me that fateful night. But he only repeated that he remembered nothing. He looked concerned, told me I was probably under stress, that I should take some time off or visit a professional. I considered it, but I worried a professional might dismiss it as paranoia. Still, the smallest rational part of me clung to that possibility, hoping for some mundane explanation. Maybe it was all in my head, an overreaction to a single strange coincidence, but each time I convinced myself of that, I would sense the static trailing behind me or feel the brush of unseen eyes lurking in the corners in an attempt to take control again. I changed my nightly routine. I forced myself to go for short walks before bed, wanting to soothe my nerves with fresh air. Yet, even outside, I felt watched. Streetlights buzzed overhead with a dull resonance, and I found myself scanning driveways and alleyways for any shape that might be following. Whenever a lamp flickered, my pulse instantly spiked, and I half expected to see a silhouette crouched under the wavering glow. One evening, while returning from such a walk, I passed my car parked across the street. It sat beneath a single streetlight that cast harsh, angular shadows. The vehicle appeared normal, but as I approached, I heard that same crackling. I'd heard in my kitchen weeks ago. It emanated from somewhere near the front bumper like static or an electrical hum. I stopped dead in my tracks, my face burning with mounting dread. Then, just as I stepped closer to investigate, the noise disappeared. My skin tingled and the hair on my arms rose in a ripple of gooseflesh. I fled inside, slamming and double-locking the door chest, heaving with shallow staccato breaths. The house welcomed me with the oppressive hush I had come to despise. I stood in the doorway panting, scanning the living room for any sign of movement. My phone lay on the table off this time, at least I thought it was. Every time I looked at it, an icy stab of apprehension cut through me. For a few moments, I considered throwing it away entirely, but the idea of not having a phone at all felt almost as terrifying. What if an actual emergency happened? What if I needed to call for help? That question settled like a weight in my mind. Need to call for help against what, though an intangible presence, a manifestation of my own paranoia. Part of me wondered if the phone itself was a gateway, some channel for an influence I didn't understand after all. It was the phone call that triggered this entire ordeal, and subsequent calls or static seemed to herald more episodes of dread. Time slowed to a trickle over the following days. My nights became a series of half-sleeps and abrupt awakenings. Each more disorienting than the last, my dreams carried me through silent hallways, the phone ever ringing in the background, intangible yet omnipresent. More than once I jolted awake with my mouth dry, heart hammering. Sure that something was in the room, I could practically taste the fear bitter and metallic on my tongue. In desperation, I resolved to contact my friend again and plead for an explanation if he truly had no memory of calling. Maybe we could retrace the phone records, dig into any possible error or glitch. Perhaps some automated system or a crossed line had faked his caller ID, leading to all this confusion. The thought of uncovering such a mundane solution offered a fragile hope. So I asked to meet him at his place one evening, a neutral space I hoped would quell my anxiety when I arrived. The atmosphere felt no less suffocating. His apartment was well-lit, airy even, but an ominous pressure still clung to me like a second skin before I could speak. He mentioned that his phone bill showed a mysterious spike. Multiple calls placed at unusual hours, none of which he recognized. He explained it calmly, trying to reassure me that we'd figure it out together. Yet as I listened, my pulse kept an erratic tempo. We cross-referenced the call logs, and sure enough, the dates and times aligned with my experiences, always around 3 a.m. Always brief that night, I left his place with more questions than answers. My mind reeled with the possibility that something was manipulating our devices. Some force beyond my comprehension during the drive home. The sense of being watched magnified tenfold. The streetlights cast long, pale beams on the asphalt, and each one seemed to illuminate a pocket of darkness, crawling with hidden shapes. My headlights revealed nothing but empty streets. Yet my heart pounded with the conviction that I wasn't alone. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my muscles felt taut enough to snap. Stepping inside my house, I tensed at the sudden realization that I had neglected to lock the door behind me when I left earlier. I don't know why that realization made my skin crawl. Perhaps I imagined that something had slipped in while I was gone, or perhaps the idea of my sanctuary left unguarded was just too much to bear. Moving slowly, I checked each room, flipping on the lights and bracing myself for any horrifying surprise. Everything appeared in its proper place, yet the dread remained. I sat on my sofa, phone in hand, determined to face whatever might come. Eventually, I noticed the faint hum again, a current of static so subtle I wasn't sure if it was real or a product of my exhausted mind. My vision blurred at the edges as adrenaline surged through my veins for a moment. I forgot how to breathe, my chest tight with panic. The phone grew warm in my hand as if it had a pulse. I fought the urge to fling it across the room. Instead, I stared at it, waiting. Then the screen flickered, cutting through the darkness with a sudden glow. The device vibrated. No number displayed this time, just a shapeless distortion of pixels. My heart thundered and I felt every beat hammering in my eardrums without waiting. I rejected the call, pressing the button so hard my thumb went numb. The phone went silent. The oppressive static vanished. I found myself in a hush so deep I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my head for a few seconds. I thought it was over, that I had broken the cycle. But as I stared into the dark, an overwhelming sense of presence weighed down on me. My vision seemed to tunnel. My breath came in short, desperate gulps. A cold dread spread through my limbs, anchoring me to the spot. The silence turned unbearable, as if the space around me held its breath. Then the phone in my grasp felt unnaturally heavy, and I realized that perhaps I had merely severed the connection, not banished whatever lurked behind it. That was when I felt the shift in the air, like a slow, invisible wave of pressure passing through the room. My peripheral vision caught a flicker, a fleeting distortion against one wall, like heat rising off asphalt in the summer. I couldn't make out a shape, only a sense of dislocation. My mind struggled to process it, teetering on the edge of rational thought. Every hair on my body stood on end and chills crawled across my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, trembling, trying to will it away when I opened them again. The distortion was gone, yet the feeling persisted. A sensation that something stood mere inches behind me, out of sight. I refused to turn around, my breath now shallow gasps that left my lungs burning. I sat motionless, phone still in hand, trapped in an impasse between fear and determination. Eventually, the suffocating pressure eased, though it never vanished completely. Once my heartbeat steadied, I glanced around the silent room. Nothing stirred. It's been days since that incident, and I haven't received any further calls. My phone logs remain empty, as if the unknown force has retreated still every time I see a phone. My stomach knots with the memory of that static and the eerie breathing on the line. I cannot shake the conviction that in answering that call weeks ago, I invited a presence into my life, something that fed on my fear and confusion. Though it seems to have withdrawn, I sense it. Watching from the periphery, waiting for the moment I let my guard down again. I now keep my phone on silent, most nights half hoping never to hear its ring again. Yet I also find myself listening intently for the faintest vibration, torn between relief and dread. In the quiet moments before dawn, I sometimes catch myself straining to hear that crackling static or a distant ring, and in those moments my pulse races and my breath quickens, as though the darkness itself is about to come alive. Once more, I've learned to accept that some warnings defy explanation, that a person can transmit a message without conscious will, compelled by forces we can't name. I no longer dismiss those fleeting premonitions. Something out there tried to protect me, or perhaps tried to lure me. Using a friend's voice as bait, I survived this ordeal without harm, but not unscathed. The house still feels different, as though the walls have soaked up my terror, and every time I glance at my phone, I brace myself for that gut-wrenching buzz, the one that tore open my reality and exposed me to a darkness I wish I could unsee. I can't claim to know what truly happened, or if it might happen again. All I can do is stand guard against the unknown that may yet lie dormant in the silent hours of the night. I escape it by staying alert, by refusing to answer calls I cannot trace, by trusting that strange sixth sense that flares when something is amiss. But the memory lingers, throbbing beneath my consciousness, a reminder that some boundaries are perilously thin, and one phone call can be enough to let the darkness in. I felt the unease pressing in on me the moment I stepped into the hospital lobby for my night.